Before there were gods to worship, before there was time to measure, there was only the gap. Not a gap in the sense you might imagine, not an emptiness between things, because there were no things yet to be apart. This was Ginnungagap, the yawning abyss, the void that existed when existence itself had not yet been imagined. Close your eyes for a moment and try to picture absolute nothing. Not darkness, because darkness requires the concept of light to have meaning. Not silence, because silence is simply the absence of sound, and sound had not been invented yet. The ancient Norse understood something that most creation myths miss entirely. The beginning was not a divine act of will. It was an accident, a cosmic collision that no one orchestrated because there was no one yet to orchestrate anything. Ginnungagap was not peaceful. Despite containing nothing, it was not calm. Think of it as a breathing emptiness, a void with potential energy coiled inside it like a spring wound too tight. The Norse people, who lived with long winters and knew the weight of darkness, understood that nothingness itself could have texture, could have presence. They gave it a name because they sensed that even voids have personality. But Ginnungagap was not alone in this pre-existence. To the south, if direction meant anything before space existed, there was Muspelheim, the realm of fire. Not fire as you know it, not the friendly flame in a hearth, or even the destructive blaze of a forest burning. Muspelheim was fire with intent, fire that flowed like water, fire that was conscious in ways that should be impossible. Rivers of flame carved through this realm, molten and ancient, hissing with a kind of awareness. The heat from Muspelheim radiated outward into the gap, a relentless force that needed nothing to sustain it because it was sustenance itself, pure energy without purpose or end. To the north, if north existed, there was Niflheim, the realm of ice and poison and mist. While Muspelheim burned with aggressive heat, Niflheim was cold in a way that went beyond temperature. It was the cold of entropy, of all motion ceasing, of time itself freezing into crystalline stillness. Through Niflheim flowed 11 rivers, called Elivagar venomous waters, that carried the essence of dissolution. These rivers froze as they flowed, ice forming upon ice, layer after layer, building upward and outward into Ginnungagap, like fingers reaching into the void. The poison in these waters didn't kill, because there was nothing yet alive to die. Instead, it transformed. It crystallized possibility into rigid form. For a span of time that cannot be measured, because time had not yet begun its counting, these two realms existed in opposition. Fire to the south, ice to the north, the gap between them. Nothing changed. Nothing progressed. It was a tableau of elemental forces with no narrative, no story, no movement toward anything resembling plot or purpose. But heat, by its nature, expands. And the heat from Muspelheim, patient and inexorable, began to radiate further into Ginnungagap. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the warmth reached the edges of Niflheim's frozen rivers. And when heat met that ancient ice, something unexpected happened. Not an explosion, not a dramatic cosmic birth announced with thunder and light. Instead, a quiet melting. Drops of water formed where ice met fire. Drip by drip, the frozen venom began to thaw. The Norse called this collision inevitable, but they didn't call it planned. There was no architect standing outside of existence, mixing elements like a chemist following a formula. This was the universe stumbling into being through pure circumstance. Fire happened to reach ice. Ice happened to melt. And in that melting, in those drops of thawed poison suspended between two elemental extremes, chemistry occurred. Molecules bonded. Patterns formed. Complexity emerged from simplicity, not because it was meant to, but because it could. In those drops, something stirred. Not thought, not yet, not consciousness, as you would recognize it, but a kind of proto-awareness, a response to stimulus, the first tremor of something that was not fire and not ice, but somehow both and neither. The drops collected and pooled, growing warmer from Muspelheim's persistent heat, but never warm enough to evaporate, held in check by Niflheim's lingering cold. The balance created a pocket of liquid existence in a universe of extremes. And in that liquid, fed by melting ice and energized by distant fire, nourished by the venom that ran through the Elivagar, something continued to stir and grow. Cells divided where there had been no cells. Organic compounds assembled where there had been no organic anything. the first protein chains folded into the first primitive structures. Not life, not exactly, not yet, but the precursor to life, the chemical foundation upon which consciousness would eventually build its throne. The ancient Norse who told this story understood what many creation myths ignore, that life did not begin in paradise, it began in poison. It began in the accidental meeting of hostile forces that should have annihilated each other, but instead created a space where neither could win, and in that stalemate, existence found its first foothold. What stirred in those drops was not holy or pure or blessed by any divine hand. It was the universe's first mistake, or perhaps its first experiment, and that stirring would not remain formless for long. From the melting ice between fire and void, the first being was about to emerge, and its birth would be as strange and terrible as the abyss that dreamed it into being. From poisoned rivers and frozen sweat came the first consciousness, not divine, not planned, not blessed, simply there, assembled molecule by molecule in the gap between extremes. This was Ymir, the first flesh to walk the void, and the Norse who remembered this story never called Ymir a god. They called Ymir something else, something older, something that existed before the categories of holy and profane had been invented. Ymir emerged from the melting ice like a sculpture revealing itself as a block of stone is chipped away. Except there was no sculptor, only heat doing what heat does, melting, dissolving, transforming solid into liquid into something that could move and breathe and think. The body that formed was massive, towering in a universe that had no sense of scale yet, because there was nothing to compare it to. Ymir was the first reference point for size, for presence, for being. But what was Ymir? The old stories struggle with this question, and perhaps that struggle tells us more than a clear answer ever could. Ymir was not male. Ymir was not female. These concepts would come later, imposed by beings who needed categories and boxes to make sense of existence. Ymir simply was, containing within a single body the capacity for all future variations. The ancient word used to describe this state has no perfect translation, but hermaphroditic comes closest, though even that word carries implications the Norse storytellers never intended. Under Ymir's arms, in the warm hollow spaces where flesh folded against flesh, sweat began to form. Not the clean sweat of exertion, or the fevered sweat of illness, but the primordial moisture of a body adjusting to existence, secreting fluids as it calibrated what it meant to be alive. And from that sweat, impossibly, came more life. Two beings emerged, male and female, the first of the frost giants. The Jötnar, born not from reproduction as later beings would understand it, but from the overflow of Ymir's existence, as if consciousness itself was so abundant in that first being, that it simply leaked out and took form. From between Ymir's legs came more. Another giant, whole and aware, born from the friction of movement and the moisture of living. This is the part of the story that makes some modern readers uncomfortable, this emphasis on fluids and flesh, and the wet machinery of creation. But the Norse didn't flinch from it. They understood that life is fundamentally grotesque before it becomes beautiful. That birth, all birth, is a messy violence of transformation. Ymir was not alone in the void for long. From the same melting ice that birthed the first giant came something else. Orthanblur, the cosmic cow, enormous and patient and necessary. While Ymir embodied the chaotic potential of life, Orthanblur represented sustenance, the capacity of the universe to feed what it accidentally creates. From Orthanblur's udders came rivers of milk, and Ymir drank, and in drinking was sustained, and in being sustained grew larger, more complex, more aware. But Orthanblur needed sustenance too. She turned to the ice blocks that still remained at the edge of Niflheim's reach, blocks salted with minerals and frozen essence, and she licked. Her tongue rasped against the ancient ice, warm and persistent, melting it slowly, tasting the salt, the minerals, the frozen time contained within. And as she licked, day after day, in a place where day had no meaning yet, something began to appear in the ice. First hair, golden and unexpected, then the curve of a head, then a face emerging from the frozen depths like someone drowning in reverse, pulled up from below into the air and light of this strange new existence. This was Buri, the first of the gods. Not born from Ymir's sweat, or fluid, or casual fecundity, born from ice itself, revealed by the patient work of the cosmic cow's tongue. Where Ymir represented chaos and abundance, and the uncontrolled flowering of life. Buri represented something else. Structure, perhaps. Purpose. The seed of what would become order imposed upon the wild chaos of mere existence. The Norse understood what they were depicting here, even if they never spoke it plainly. Two kinds of being, two philosophies of existence, born from the same melting ice, but fundamentally different. The giants, numerous and wild, self-generating and fecund, carrying forward the chaotic energy of Ginnungagap itself. And the gods, fewer, deliberate, carved out, rather than flowing forth, containing within themselves the impulse toward organization and control. Ymir did not know that emergence of Buri was a death sentence. How could there be knowledge of death when death had never happened? Ymir simply existed, drinking milk and spawning giants, and occupying the void with a kind of innocent monstrosity. Neither good nor evil, because those concepts required consciousness of consequence, required understanding that actions ripple outward through time. Ymir had no such understanding. Ymir simply was. But being first does not guarantee survival. Sometimes being first means being the foundation, the raw material that everything else builds upon. Sometimes the first must die, so that the second can define itself through opposition. The Norse who told this story knew this truth intimately. They lived in a world where sacrifice was not metaphor, but necessity, where the old must make way for the new, where every creation required corresponding destruction. Buri stood in the void, newly revealed from ice, and looked upon Ymir and the growing multitude of frost giants. And perhaps even then, before anything had been spoken or decided, the future was determined. Two kinds of consciousness cannot occupy the same space indefinitely. Eventually, one must dominate, or both must find separate realms. But there were no separate realms yet. There was only Ginnungagap and Muspelheim and Niflheim, only the gap and the fire and the ice. The first being to ever exist was already doomed. And from that first flesh, from its eventual ending, would come everything else you've ever known. Three brothers stood over the sleeping giant, and in their hands they held the choice: let chaos continue, or drown it in blood and build something new. Their names were Odin, Vili, and Ve, grandsons of Buri, who had been licked from the ice, sons of Bor, who had married a giantess named Bestla. Yes, even the gods had giant blood running through their veins, which makes what came next even more complicated than simple tales of good conquering evil. The brothers were young in a universe that was still young, but they looked upon what existed and found it insufficient. Ymir sprawled across the void, massive and unconscious to consequence, spawning frost giants from sweat and moisture, while Othumbla grazed on salt ice, and the brothers saw not harmony but stagnation. They saw a cosmos with no direction, no purpose, no architecture, just endless reproduction of chaotic beings, with no plan beyond existence itself. But was that really a problem? Or did the brothers simply want what young ambitious beings always want to impose their will upon reality, to shape existence according to their vision, rather than accepting what had come before? The old stories don't answer this question directly. They present the brothers as heroes, builders of the world, fathers of order. But if you listen carefully to how the story unfolds, you might hear something else underneath, the sound of a conspiracy being born. They met in secret, these three brothers, somewhere in the expanding void where Ymir could not hear them, perhaps near the edges of Muspelheim where the fire's crackling would mask their voices, perhaps in the deep cold of Niflheim where frost deadened sound. They talked, and in talking, they planned. Vili, whose name means will or intent, argued for action. Ve, whose name connects to holiness and sacred space, framed their plan as necessary purification. And Odin, already clever, already seeing patterns and possibilities that his brothers missed, calculated the consequences and decided they were acceptable. What they planned was nothing less than cosmic revolution. Not simply killing Ymir, though that would be radical enough, ending the first being, the progenitor of all the frost giants, the entity that had emerged from the void's first stirring. No, they planned something more total. They would kill Ymir in such a way that the blood would destroy nearly everything that had come from Ymir. A cleansing, a reset, an extinction event designed to wipe the slate clean so they could draw their own designs upon it. Were they justified? The frost giants, by all accounts, had done nothing wrong. They simply existed, as their nature dictated. They were chaotic, yes, but chaos is not evil. It's simply the absence of imposed structure. The giants threatened no one because there was no one to threaten. They built nothing because there was nothing that needed building. They were content in a way that the brothers, looking at them, could never be. But contentment, perhaps, was the problem. The brothers were not content. They carried within themselves a vision of something more, something ordered and intentional, and that vision demanded sacrifice. Not their own sacrifice, not yet. That would come later in different forms. For now, the sacrifice required would be paid in giant blood. The approach was careful. The brothers were not certain of their strength against Ymir, whose size dwarfed even their considerable power. So they waited for sleep, that temporary death that even primordial beings must surrender to. They watched Ymir's breathing slow, watched the massive chest rise and fall with the rhythm of deep unconsciousness. Perhaps they felt doubt in that moment. Perhaps Vili questioned whether they truly had the right. Perhaps Ve wondered if this murder could really be called sacred. Perhaps even Odin, clever Odin, who would later sacrifice so much for wisdom, hesitated before crossing the line that separates those who think about violence from those who commit it. But if they hesitated, the hesitation was brief. 3 weapons rose, 3 blows fell. The old stories don't specify what weapons they used or exactly how they killed the first being, and maybe that omission is intentional. Maybe the act itself was so terrible, so foundational to everything that came after, that the specific details were too heavy to remember clearly. Or maybe the Norse who told this story understood that the means matter less than the choice, the moment when potential became action, when philosophy became murder. Ymir woke to dying. Imagine that existing since the void first stirred, living in unconscious harmony with your own nature, then suddenly torn from sleep by agony. Did Ymir understand what was happening? Did the first consciousness to ever exist have time to grasp betrayal before that consciousness ended? Or was death so foreign, so unprecedented, that Ymir simply experienced confusion and pain and then nothing? The blood came instantly and catastrophically, not a wound that could be staunched or a bleeding that could be slowed. This was arterial, cosmic, total. Blood poured from Ymir like oceans birthing themselves, a red flood that filled Ginnungagap and swept through the realms of fire and ice. The frost giants, Ymir's accidental children, were caught in that flood. They who had been born from sweat now drowned in blood. Generation upon generation of chaotic beings, erased in the time it takes a heart to stop beating. Only 2 survived, Bergelmir and his wife, who by chance, or cunning or fate, managed to climb onto something that floated, some piece of debris, or perhaps Ymir's own body, not yet fully submerged. They rode the blood flood to its edges and survived, carrying forward the giant lineage, ensuring that the brothers' genocide was not quite complete. And perhaps that was necessary too. Perhaps the gods needed enemies to define themselves against. Perhaps Odin already understood that order means nothing without chaos to oppose it, that the gods would need the giants as eternal adversaries to give their existence shape and purpose. The flood eventually stilled. The blood settled and pooled and began the slow work of cooling, coagulating, transforming from liquid to something more solid. And the 3 brothers stood, in the aftermath of what they had done, looking at the corpse of the being who had been first, surrounded by the evidence of mass extinction, and they did not mourn. Instead, they began to plan what came next. They had murdered their way to power. Now they would build their way to legitimacy. From Ymir's corpse, from the raw material of that cosmic violence, they would construct something unprecedented. Not mere existence, but a world. Not just beings living in void, but realms with structure and purpose and defined borders. They would take everything that Ymir had been and remake it into everything they wanted reality to become. Creation and destruction are not opposites. Sometimes they are the same act viewed from different angles. They built paradise from murder, every mountain a bone, every ocean blood, every cloud a piece of brain scattered across the sky. The question that hangs over this act of construction is one the Norse never tried to answer directly. Can beauty emerge from such horror? Or does the horror taint everything that comes after, seeping through soil and stone like poison through water? The 3 brothers stood over Ymir's corpse and saw not tragedy but opportunity. not a being ended but raw materials waiting to be shaped. They did not bury the first flesh out of respect or remorse. They butchered it with purpose, with vision, with the cold practicality of architects who understand that foundation matters more than sentiment. Ymir's flesh became the earth itself, not symbolically, not in poetic metaphor. The skin and muscle and fat of the primordial giant were torn apart and spread across the void to form soil and clay and the substance of land. When you walk on ground, when you dig your fingers into dirt, you are touching what was once alive, what once breathed and moved and existed as a singular consciousness. The earth remembers being Ymir. Somewhere deep in its geological memory, the land still carries the echo of that first and final scream. The blood became oceans. All of it. That same blood that had flooded Ginnungagap and drowned a generation of frost giants now settled into basins and depressions in Ymir's stretched flesh. Rivers formed from the flow of it, arteries and veins mapped onto the landscape, still moving, still circulating through a body that was no longer whole, but somehow still functioned as a system. The water in every stream and sea carries salt and iron, the taste of blood diluted but never fully absent. When ancient sailors spoke of the ocean being alive, perhaps they understood something literally true that modern people have forgotten. The brothers took Ymir's bones and broke them, not cleanly, not carefully, but with violence that matched the violence of the killing. Shattered bone became mountains, jagged peaks that still show the fracture lines if you know how to look. Cliffs and ridges mark where the bones split under divine hands. The teeth and smaller fragments were scattered to become stones and boulders, ranging in size from mountains down to pebbles, each one a piece of what had been Ymir's skeleton, the framework that had held the first being upright. But perhaps the most disturbing transformation was what they did with Ymir's skull. The brothers lifted it, and it must have been impossibly heavy, vast beyond comprehension, and inverted it to form the sky itself. The dome of heaven is a murdered giant's cranium, arched over everything, containing all of existence within the space where thoughts once formed. To hold the skull in place at its four corners, the brothers enlisted 4 dwarves, Northri, Southri, Ostri, and Vestri, whose names simply mean north, south, east, and west. The origin of these dwarves is itself strange. Some sources claim they formed from maggots in Ymir's flesh, life born from decay, consciousness emerging from rot. These 4 beings were given the eternal task of holding up the sky, ensuring that Ymir's skull would never fall and crush everything beneath it. The brain did not remain inside the skull. The brothers pulled it out and threw it into the air, and where it dispersed became clouds. Every storm, every gentle cumulus, every dark mass that gathers before rain, these are fragments of Ymir's thoughts made visible, still processing in some abstract way, still computing the mathematics of existence. When clouds gather and form shapes, when they seem to have intention or direction, perhaps that's the last remnants of the first consciousness trying to reassemble itself, trying to think one final thought. From Ymir's eyebrows, the brothers formed something specific and deliberate. They curved those brows into a protective ring and called it Midgard Middle-earth, the realm that would eventually house humanity. The eyebrows became walls, fortifications against the remaining giants who watched from the edges of creation with understandable hostility. Midgard was designed as a safe space, a shelter, though the Norse understood that safety is always relative, always temporary, always requiring vigilance and maintenance. Somewhere during this construction, or perhaps existing before it, or maybe emerging because of it, the sources are unclear and contradictory there, grew Yggdrasil, the world tree. An ash tree of impossible size, its roots reaching down through all the forming realms, its branches extending upward to touch what had been placed in the sky. The tree would connect everything, the vertical axis around which the 9 worlds would arrange themselves. But that story belongs to another telling. For now, it's enough to know that the tree was there, watching, growing, its roots already drinking from wells of memory and fate. The brothers were not finished. They captured sparks from Muspelheim's eternal fires and placed them in Ymir's skull to become stars, fixed points of light in the bone dome of heaven. They created the sun and moon from other sources, perhaps more fire, perhaps something else, and set them on paths across the sky. But these celestial bodies were not safe in their courses. 2 wolves, Skirl and Hati, born from darkness and hunger, began chasing the sun and moon from the moment of their creation. The wolves never stop, never tire, always pursuing, and when they finally catch their prey during Ragnarok, the lights will go out forever. But for now, the chase continues, which is why the sun and moon move, why day follows day, in endless rhythm. What the brothers created was not a pristine paradise. It was a functional world, pragmatic and brutal in its construction. Every element carried the weight of its origin. The land was murder made solid. The sea was genocide made liquid. The sky was a trophy worn by reality itself. And yet, despite this foundation of violence, life would find the world beautiful. Plants would grow in Ymir's flesh. Fish would swim in Ymir's blood. Birds would fly beneath Ymir's skull. Creatures would live and love and die, mostly unaware that their entire existence played out inside and upon a corpse. The world was ready, but it was still empty of the beings who would tell these stories. Two tribes of gods, two ways of seeing the universe, and when they went to war, not even divine power could determine a winner. The cosmos that Odin and his brothers built from Ymir's corpse was never meant to house only one kind of divinity. Perhaps it couldn't. Perhaps reality itself requires competing philosophies to maintain tension, to prevent any single vision from calcifying into tyranny. Asgard rose first, built by the Aesir Odin's family, his allies, those who shared his vision of order imposed through strength and wisdom. The realm gleamed with golden halls and fortified walls, each structure designed not for comfort but for defense. Valhalla stood at its center, the great feasting hall where warriors would eventually gather. But even this place of celebration had a military purpose that would become clear only later. Odin's throne, Hlithskjalf, sat high in another hall, positioned so the Allfather could see across all 9 worlds simultaneously, not to admire, to surveil, to watch for threats and opportunities with equal attention. Asgard was magnificent, but it was magnificent in the way a fortress is magnificent, beautiful, because it's functional, impressive, because it needs to be. The Aesir embodied one kind of divine power. They were gods of sky and storm, of battle and law, of poetry and death. They valued hierarchy, structure, oaths that bound actions to intentions. They built walls and made rules and enforced consequences. Odin sought wisdom through sacrifice. Thor protected through violence. Tyr upheld justice through unwavering principle. These were gods who believed order must be maintained, even when maintaining it required terrible choices. But somewhere else in the forming cosmos, another kind of divinity had emerged. The Vanir, dwelling in Vanaheim, represented something fundamentally different. They were gods of earth and growing things, of fertility and prosperity, of the magic that comes from understanding natural cycles rather than commanding them. Where the Aesir built fortresses, the Vanir cultivated fields. Where the Aesir made laws, the Vanir worked with older rhythms that predated legislation. They practiced Seether, a form of magic the Aesir considered feminine and therefore lesser, though it was arguably more powerful than anything Odin's warriors could accomplish with strength alone. 2 philosophies, 2 approaches to divinity, and inevitably, conflict. The Aesir-Vanir war erupted for reasons the old stories don't entirely explain. Perhaps the Aesir saw the Vanir's different approach as threatening. Perhaps the Vanir resented the Aesir's claims to supremacy. Perhaps it was simply what happens when 2 groups of powerful beings exist in proximity without agreed-upon hierarchy. The war was brutal and strange, fought with weapons but also with magic that twisted reality itself. The Vanir proved they could not be conquered by force. The Aesir proved they would not surrender to magical superiority. Battle after battle ended in stalemate. Years passed, or centuries, or however time was measured, when gods fought gods. Neither side gained decisive advantage. Neither side would accept defeat. And slowly, a terrible realization settled over both pantheons. They could destroy each other, but destruction would benefit neither. The war could continue forever, consuming resources and attention, preventing both groups from doing whatever gods are supposed to do besides fight. So they negotiated. Not peace exactly, but an armed truce held together by the most ancient of diplomatic tools, the exchange of hostages. The Vanir sent Njörður, god of seas and wealth, along with his twin children Freya and Freya, to live among the Aesir. These three would be absorbed into Asgard, becoming Aesir in practice, if not in origin. In return, the Aesir sent Hœnir, whose handsomeness and apparent wisdom made him seem a worthy exchange, along with Mimir, who actually possessed the wisdom that Hœnir only appeared to have. But the exchange was not equal, and the Vanir discovered this quickly. Hœnir was beautiful and spoke well when Mimir whispered advice in his ear, but alone he was indecisive, unable to make judgments without his companion's counsel. The Vanir felt cheated, betrayed by gods who claimed to value honor and oaths. Their response was decisive and brutal. They beheaded Mimir and sent his head back to Asgard as a message about what happens to those who negotiate in bad faith. Odin received Mimir's severed head and did not rage or retaliate. Instead, he did something stranger. He preserved the head with herbs and magic, and he spoke charms over it until Mimir's consciousness returned to the dead flesh. The head could still think, still speak, still offer wisdom from beyond death. Odin kept it, consulted it, carried it to the well that would later bear Mimir's name. A counselor who could not be corrupted or intimidated or killed because he was already dead. Perhaps the perfect advisor for a god who trusted no one completely. The war ended not with reconciliation but with exhausted acceptance. Both sides kept their hostages, and those hostages adapted to their new homes with varying degrees of success. Freya and Freya became beloved in Asgard, bringing prosperity and beauty to a realm that had specialized in grimmer virtues. Njörður remained more separate, always slightly apart, god of wealth from the sea standing among gods of war and death. And in Vanaheim, Hœnir presumably learned to make decisions without Mimir's whispers, or perhaps he remained forever uncertain. A god whose primary role was being present without being particularly useful. Asgard after the war was a place of layers, golden and glorious on its surface, yes, but underneath the beauty was calculation. Every feast was also a strategic gathering. Every alliance contained clauses and contingencies. The great walls that surrounded the realm were not decorative. They were necessary, designed to hold against giants who remembered Ymir's murder, against forces of chaos that the Aesir had pushed to the edges but never eliminated. Even the gods who lived there understood that Asgard was not eternal paradise, but a fortress built on contested ground, always preparing for the next war, always aware that peace was temporary, and purchased with compromises that could unravel at any moment. From Odin's throne, the All-Father watched everything, seeing across all realms, gathering information, planning moves and countermoves in a game whose rules were still being written. The cosmos was taking shape, but shape requires structure, and structure requires force to maintain. Asgard would provide that force, whether the other realms welcomed it or not. Between the gods above and the dead below lies the human world. Midgard, Middle-earth, formed from Ymir's eyebrows into a fortress realm surrounded by ocean. But that ocean is not neutral water. It's blood still, Ymir's blood, diluted and salted but carrying memory in every molecule. And in that ocean swims something that makes protection and threat indistinguishable. Jormungandr, the world serpent, circles Midgard completely, so vast that it bites its own tail to complete the circuit. One of Loki's monstrous children, thrown into the sea by the gods who feared what it might become, and in the sea it grew, and grew, until it was large enough to encircle the entire world, a living boundary between the familiar and the unknown. Some stories suggest the serpent protects Midgard from what lies beyond. Others suggest it traps humanity inside, preventing escape. Perhaps both interpretations are true. Perhaps Jormungandr is the world's guardian and its prison warden simultaneously. Connecting Midgard to Asgard is Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, shimmering and solid and impossible. A pathway between mortal and divine realms, though few mortals ever walk it. The bridge is beautiful, but beauty in Norse cosmology often signals danger. Bifrost will burn during Ragnarok, its colours consumed by fire giants marching to war. Even now, it exists as a promise and a threat connection that can be severed, access that can be denied. Beyond Midgard's protective circle lies Jotunheim, land of the giants. Not a realm of evil, but of chaos that refuses domestication. Mountains that dwarf anything in Midgard, storms that rage for years. Forests where trees grow in impossible directions, rivers that flow uphill. The giants who dwell there are Ymir's descendants, children of the being the gods murdered to make reality. Their resentment is ancient and justified, yet they are not united in vengeance. Some giants are wise, some are foolish, some are beautiful, some are grotesque. They are not a monolith, but a category, as varied as the gods themselves. The relationship between Asgard and Jotunheim is complicated by blood and marriage. Odin's mother was a giant. Many gods take giant wives or lovers. Thor, who spends much of his time killing giants, does so with enthusiasm that suggests intimacy rather than pure hatred. He knows giants personally, individually, and kills them anyway. The boundary between god and giant is more permeable than the gods like to admit. Perhaps what separates them is not nature but choice, philosophy rather than species. The gods chose order. The giants chose to remain wild, and those choices made them eternal enemies despite their shared ancestry. Between and below these realms exist others, harder to map with certainty. Alfheim, home of the light elves, beings of beauty and ambiguous purpose. The sources say little about them except that they exist, that they are fair, that Freya rules them. Perhaps they are allies of the gods, or perhaps they simply tolerate Asgard's supremacy while pursuing their own incomprehensible goals. Below or beside Alfheim, the cosmology is deliberately vague, lies Svartalfheim, realm of dark elves or dwarves, depending on which story you follow. The sources conflate these beings or separate them based on context. What's certain is that dwarves are master craftsmen, forging objects of power in underground workshops. They created Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, from a lightning bolt and star metal. They created Gungnir, Odin's spear that never misses. They created Gleipnir, the impossible ribbon that binds Fenrir. The gods depend on dwarfcraft for their most powerful weapons, which means the gods are not self-sufficient. Even divine power requires external expertise, alliances with beings who work in darkness and demand strange prices for their services. Connecting all these realms, providing the structure upon which the cosmos arranges itself, stands Yggdrasil, the world tree. An ash of impossible size, its 3 roots drinking from 3 wells in different realms, its branches extending through all 9 worlds. The tree existed before the gods, and will likely outlast them. It's older than Odin, possibly older than Ymir, though its origin is never explained. Perhaps it grew from the void itself. Perhaps it is the void given form and direction. The tree is not merely structure, it's alive, sentient in ways that predate language. Creatures live on it, in it, traverse its trunk between realms. A squirrel, named Ratatoska, runs up and down, carrying insults between the eagle in its branches and the dragon gnawing at its roots. 4 stags eat its leaves. The tree suffers their consumption and continues growing. It bleeds sap and continues standing. It holds everything together through will or nature or whatever force allows a tree to be conscious of its own importance. The gods did not plant Yggdrasil. They discovered it and built their cosmos around it, arranging realms like ornaments on branches. But the tree's loyalty is not to Asgard. When Ragnarok comes, when everything burns and drowns and dies, the tree will shake but possibly survive. Perhaps new worlds will grow from its surviving roots. Perhaps it has seen this cycle before. The tree knows something the gods don't, and it keeps that knowledge in its rings, in its roots, in the slow, patient consciousness of wood and bark that witnesses ages while remaining silent. Below these realms of life and light and chaotic possibility lie the realms of ending. Below the world of the living lie the realms of endings, where the dead wander grey shores, where a dragon eats corpses and gnaws at reality itself, where a giant holds a sword of fire and counts down to the day everything burns. Death in Norse cosmology is not punishment. It's destination, inevitable as winter following autumn, as natural as roots growing downward into darkness. Helheim is where most of the dead eventually arrive. Not the warriors chosen for Valhalla, not the drowned claimed by Ran's nets, not the handful selected for Freya's hall. Everyone else, the ordinary dead. Those who died of age, or illness, or simple bad luck. They walk or ride down a long dark road until they reach Gjallarbrú, the bridge over the river Gjöll, and cross into a realm that is neither torture nor reward, but simply continuation in different form. The ruler of this realm is Hel, daughter of Loki and the giantess Angrboda, sister to Fenrir and Jörmungandr. Like her brothers, she was cast out by the gods who feared what she might become. Odin threw her into Niflheim and gave her dominion over the dead. Her appearance reflects her nature. Half of her body is living, beautiful, vital. The other half is corpse, rotted, dead flesh clinging to bone. She is both states simultaneously, neither entirely alive nor entirely deceased. Some sources describe her as stern but fair, demanding respect but not cruelty. Others suggest she barely notices the dead at all, ruling through indifference rather than judgment. Helheim itself is grey, mist and shadow, and the absence of strong colour, not torment but melancholy, existence drained of intensity. The dead feast in halls, but the food tastes of nothing. They sleep, but dreams do not come. They exist in echo of life, memory without the sharp edges that make memory painful or beautiful. For some, this might be peace. For others, it's the slow dissolution of everything that made them individual. Over centuries, the dead in Helheim fade like old photographs, becoming less distinct, less themselves, until only vague presence remains. Below Helheim, deeper still, lies Niflheim itself, the primordial realm of ice and mist that existed before Ymir, before the gods, before anything except fire and void. While the upper levels of the cosmos were built from Ymir's corpse, Niflheim was never transformed or claimed. It remains as it was at the beginning, ancient, cold, indifferent to everything that happened after. The realm of endings connects directly to the realm of beginnings, as if the cosmos is circular, as if the oldest place and the final destination are somehow the same location viewed from different angles. In the darkest depths of Niflheim, in the place called Niflhel, lies something that should terrify even gods. Nidhugga, the dragon or serpent who gnaws eternally at Yggdrasil's roots. The world tree extends downward into this realm, and Nidhugga has been chewing at those roots since before time was properly counted. The dragon doesn't eat from hunger. It eats because that's its nature, its purpose, the role it plays in the cosmic architecture. Between gnawing at the tree, it also chews on corpses, specifically those of oathbreakers and murderers, the dead who earned special contempt, even in a cosmology that doesn't much traffic in moral judgment. The question no one answers directly. What happens when Nidhugga finally chews through Yggdrasil's roots? Does the tree fall? Does everything collapse? Or has the dragon been gnawing forever, and will gnaw forever, damage without conclusion, threat without resolution? Perhaps Nidhugga is not trying to destroy the tree but testing it, proving its strength through constant assault, ensuring it stays vigorous through perpetual wounding. Opposite Niflheim in cosmic geography and philosophy stands Muspelheim, the realm of fire that existed before creation, unchanged by everything that came after. Where Niflheim is ancient cold, Muspelheim is ancient heat. Where ice preserves and imprisons, fire consumes and transforms. The realm burns with sentient flame, rivers of lava flowing with something like awareness, heat that doesn't need fuel because it is fuel, self-sustaining and eternal. In Muspelheim dwells Surtur, first and greatest of the fire giants. He holds a flaming sword, and he has been holding it since before the gods murdered Ymir, since before the 9 realms were arranged on Yggdrasil's branches. Surtur does not plot or scheme or rage against the gods who claimed the cosmos. He simply waits, patient as stone, certain as mathematics. He knows what's coming because it's already written in the structure of reality itself. Ragnarok is not a possibility he fears or hopes for. It's an appointment he will keep, a role he will fulfill when the time comes. The fire giants of Muspelheim are not numerous like the frost giants of Jotunheim. They don't need to be. Fire doesn't require numbers to be effective. A single flame can consume a forest. A single sword of fire can burn 9 worlds. These 3 realms, Helheim, Niflheim, Muspelheim, represent the boundary conditions of existence, death and ice and fire. The forces that bookend life, that stand at the beginning and the end of everything. They're connected to the upper realms, not despite being opposites, but because of it. Yggdrasil's roots drink from wells in all 3 realms, drawing power from endings and beginnings simultaneously. The tree understands what the gods perhaps don't, that destruction is not separate from creation but woven into it, that every foundation contains the seeds of its own dissolution, that fire and ice will eventually reclaim what fire and ice accidentally created. The cosmos is a temporary arrangement, borrowed time between states of elemental simplicity, He tore out his own eye and hung himself from the world tree, not for glory, not for power, but to see what was coming. And what he saw drove him to madness, or something close to it, something that looks like wisdom from certain angles, but from others resembles obsession, desperation, the frantic energy of someone who knows exactly how long they have left and refuses to accept it. Odin is not a benevolent father, watching over creation with serene confidence. He is a schemer, a manipulator, a god who understands that knowledge is the only true power, and that knowledge always demands payment in flesh or sanity, or both. Every culture has its trickster gods and its wise gods, but rarely are they the same entity. Odin is both, and the combination makes him dangerous in ways that pure trickery or pure wisdom never could be. The first great sacrifice came at Mimir's well, one of 3 wells that feed Yggdrasil's roots. This well contained knowledge, not facts or information, but understanding of cosmic patterns, the ability to see how threads of cause and effect weave through the 9 realms. Odin came to the well and asked to drink. Mimir, who guarded it, named the price, an eye, not metaphorically, literally. The god who wanted to see everything would have to give up half his vision to gain true sight. Some versions of the story say Odin hesitated. Others suggest he plucked the eye out immediately, so eager for knowledge that physical mutilation was barely worth considering. Either way, the eye was surrendered. Odin drank from the well, and what he saw in those waters changed him irrevocably. The knowledge showed him patterns, yes, and possibilities, yes, but most importantly it showed him endings. His ending, the god's ending. Ragnarok, inevitable as sunrise, approaching like a storm on the horizon that no amount of preparation could prevent. Imagine gaining the knowledge you've sacrificed for, only to discover that the future is fixed, that all your power and wisdom can't change what's coming, that you are doomed not despite your strength, but perhaps because of it. That's what Odin saw in Mimir's well, and instead of accepting doom with grace, he decided to fight it. Not through direct confrontation, you can't fight fate like you fight an enemy, but through preparation, through gathering every scrap of knowledge and power that might, possibly, in some configuration he hasn't thought of yet, provide a way out. The second sacrifice was worse, because it was self-inflicted and sustained. Odin took his own spear, Gungnir, and pierced himself through the side. Then he hung himself from Yggdrasil's branches, suspended above the void, and he waited. 9 days and 9 nights without food or water, wounded and alone, the All-Father making himself a sacrifice to himself because there was no higher power to sacrifice to. This wasn't ritual suicide. This was ordeal. Vision quest. A deliberate crossing of the boundary between life and death to see what could be learned in that liminal space. What he sought in that suffering was the runes. Not letters in the alphabet sense, though they could be written and read. The runes were deeper than communication. They were the fundamental code of reality, the symbols that shaped what existed and how it existed. To know the runes was to have access to creation's source code, the ability to rewrite aspects of reality itself through proper arrangement of these cosmic characters. Magic in Norse mythology isn't supernatural, it's hypernatural, an understanding of systems so deep that manipulation becomes possible. On the 9th night, hovering between life and death, Odin looked down into the void beneath Yggdrasil and saw them. The runes revealed themselves not as gift, but as recognition the seeker had suffered enough to be worthy of seeing. He screamed and fell, or perhaps flew, or perhaps the distinction between falling and flying no longer mattered. When he rose again, he carried knowledge of the runes, and with that knowledge came power that made him the greatest sorcerer among the gods. He could curse and bless, could see hidden things, could manipulate fate itself within narrow limits. But limits still existed. The runes were powerful, but they weren't omnipotent. They couldn't undo what was already written in the largest sense. Odin's hunger for knowledge didn't end with those 2 great sacrifices. It never ends. Every morning, he sends out his 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin thought and memory, to fly across all 9 realms and return with information. Every evening they perch on his shoulders and whisper what they've seen and heard into his remaining ear. He hears everything. Whispered plots, secret loves, hidden treasures, gathering storms. The ravens are extensions of his consciousness, his eyes and ears multiplied and distributed across reality. But there's a detail in the old poems that suggests even this daily ritual carries cost. Odin says he fears each morning that Hugin might not return, but he fears more that Munin might not come back. Thought he can manage without. But losing memory would be losing himself, losing the accumulated weight of everything he's learned and sacrificed for. The god who gave an eye for knowledge is more afraid of forgetting than of ceasing to think. Perhaps because he knows that if he forgets what's coming, he won't be able to prepare. Perhaps because the memories of his sacrifices are the only proof that they meant something. What did all this cost by him? Power, yes. Wisdom, certainly. The respect and fear of other gods, the ability to see across worlds from his throne, mastery of magic that makes him nearly invincible in any conventional sense, but also burden. The weight of knowing that everything he's building will burn, that every warrior he gathers for the final battle is a warrior who will die in that battle, that his son will avenge him, but it won't matter because everything will already be ending by then, that the world tree he hung from will shake and possibly fall, that the runes he suffered for might not save him, that all his preparation might be elaborate denial dressed up as strategy. Odin is the most powerful of the Aesir, and simultaneously the most tragic. He can see the future, but can't change it. He can manipulate fate within narrow parameters, but can't escape the larger pattern. He traded his eye for sight and saw too much, saw exactly how powerless even gods are against the fundamental structure of reality. And yet he doesn't surrender, doesn't accept, doesn't go gentle into the doom he knows is coming. Instead, he schemes. He prepares. He gathers warriors and hoards knowledge and makes alliances and tells himself that maybe, possibly, if he's clever enough and ruthless enough and willing to sacrifice enough, he might find the loophole that lets him survive what cannot be survived. The one-eyed god who sees everything, blinded by the very knowledge he suffered to obtain, unable to look away from the approaching darkness, unable to see anything except the end. And because he knows the end is coming, everything he does afterward takes on desperate purpose. They called it paradise, a hall of eternal feasting and glory, where brave warriors would spend eternity drinking and fighting among the gods. But Odin wasn't building a heaven. He was building an army for a war he knew he'd lose. And every warrior who died with weapon in hand became a potential recruit for that final doomed battle. Valhalla stands in Asgard, golden and vast, impossible to miss. The hall has 540 doors, each so wide that 800 warriors can march through side by side without touching shoulders. Do the arithmetic that's capacity for over 400,000 soldiers, not a feast hall, a barracks. The roof is thatched with shields, overlapping like scales on a serpent. The rafters are spears, crossed and bound, so that even the architecture speaks of war. This is not a place designed for peace or rest. This is a structure built with singular purpose, to house and train the army that will fight beside Odin when everything ends. The warriors who fill Valhalla are called Einherjar, the once fighters, those who fell in battle and were chosen by Odin for something more than simple death. But chosen is the critical word, and it carries implications that shatter the comfortable narrative of warrior paradise. The Valkyries, Odin's shield maidens, do the choosing. They ride out before battles, beautiful and terrible, and they decide which warriors will live and which will die. Not based on bravery alone, though bravery matters. Not based on skill, though skill is considered. They choose based on Odin's needs, his strategic calculations, his assessment of who will be useful when Ragnarok comes. A warrior fighting for his life, surrounded by enemies, calling on the gods for strength, he doesn't know that his fate was determined before he ever entered battle. That the Valkyries have already decided whether his blade will strike true or whether it will slip at the crucial moment, whether the enemy's arrow will miss or find his throat. He thinks he's fighting for survival, for glory, for his people. He doesn't realize he's auditioning for a role in a cosmic military drama where the ending is already written. Those chosen by the Valkyries are carried to Valhalla on their horses, flying across Bifrost or through stranger paths between worlds. They wake in the Golden Hall, wounds healed, strength restored, welcomed by Odin himself. They are given mead that never runs dry, served by the Valkyries who selected them. They are told they are honored, chosen, special, and perhaps they are, but they are also soldiers, and soldiers exist to fight. Every morning, the Einherjar arm themselves and go out to the fields of Asgard and wage war against each other. Not training exercises. Actual combat, brutal and total, where warriors hack and stab and kill their companions with the same intensity they showed in the mortal battles that ended their first lives. By afternoon, the field is covered with the dead, limbs severed, skulls crushed, bodies broken in every way bodies can break. And then, as evening approaches, something impossible happens. The dead rise, wounds close, severed limbs reattach or regrow. The warriors who were enemies hours before walk back to Valhalla as companions, laughing about the kills they scored, the techniques they practiced, the small improvements they noticed in their form. They feast together on the meat of Sahirimnir, a boar that is slaughtered each evening and comes back whole each morning, another creature trapped in an eternal cycle of death and resurrection. They drink mead served by the Valkyries. They tell stories and boast and sing. And the next morning, they kill each other again. This is not reward, this is training. Odin is keeping his army sharp, ensuring they remember how to fight, how to die, how to rise, and continue fighting despite impossible odds. Because when Ragnarok comes, they will need exactly these skills, the ability to face death without flinching, to fight knowing survival is temporary, to continue combat even when hope is gone. Do the Einherjar understand this? Do they know they're being prepared for Ragnarok? Some sources suggest yes, that they know and accept their role proudly. Others hint at darker possibilities, that they're trapped in a cycle they can't escape, honoured prisoners in a golden cage, conscripts who can't refuse their commander even in death. Perhaps both interpretations are true. Perhaps some warriors embrace their fate, while others slowly realize that paradise has become prison. That eternal glory feels different when you've experienced it for centuries and know it's all rehearsal for an ending you can't prevent. What's often forgotten is that Valhalla isn't the only destination for the worthy dead. Freya, goddess of love and war and magic, has her own hall called Folkvanga Folkfield, and she receives half of those who die in battle. The sources don't explain the selection criteria clearly. Does Freya get first choice? Does she and Odin divide them equally? Do the Valkyries serve both, or does Freya have her own collectors? The ambiguity suggests that even among gods, the dead are resources to be divided, assets to be allocated according to agreements the myths don't fully explain. Odin's connection to death extends beyond warriors who die gloriously in combat. He is also the god of the hanged, the deity to whom executed criminals were dedicated. When a man was hanged from a tree for his crimes, he became Odin's sacrifice, his death payment to the god who had hanged himself from Yggdrasil. This aspect of Odin, Lord of the Gallows, god of desperate men and shameful deaths, sits uncomfortably beside his role as All-Father and Warrior King. But the Norse didn't separate these aspects into different entities. Odin contains multitudes, including the darkest corners of death and sacrifice. From his throne in Valhalla, Odin watches his army grow. Every day, more warriors die, and more Valkyries carry them across Bifrost. The number swells toward that capacity the hall was built for. Hundreds of thousands of fighters, the largest military force ever assembled. And Odin knows, because he has paid dearly for knowledge, that even this vast army won't be enough, that when they march out through those 540 doors to face the forces of chaos at Ragnarok, they will fight magnificently and lose completely. But he gathers them anyway, because a god who has seen his doom and continues preparing for battle is either the most noble or most foolish being in creation, and perhaps nobility and foolishness are closer than anyone wants to admit. With a hammer that could shatter mountains and a temper that matched the storm, Thor was humanity's protector. But he protected them because he loved the battle, not necessarily the humans. The distinction matters, though the people of Midgard probably didn't care much about his motivations when giants threatened their settlements and Thor arrived with thunder rolling in his wake. Thor was the strongest of the Aesir, and he knew it, and he made sure everyone else knew it too. His hammer Mjolnir was forged by dwarves from a lightning bolt and star metal, compact enough to hide in a shirt, but heavy enough that only Thor could lift it. When thrown, it flew straight and true, crushing whatever it struck, then returned to Thor's hand like a loyal hound. The hammer could level mountains. It could kill giants with a single blow. It could consecrate and bless, though Thor used it far more often for breaking skulls than for blessing ceremonies. Unlike his father Odin, who schemed and plotted and sacrificed for knowledge, Thor's approach to problems was refreshingly direct. Giant threatening the gods, hit it with hammer. Troll stealing cattle, hit it with hammer. Cosmic serpent encircling the world, try to hit it with hammer. Thor was not a complicated god, and that simplicity was both his strength and his limitation. He didn't understand subtlety, didn't trust magic that relied on words rather than strength, didn't have patience for plans that took more than an hour to explain. But he was honest. When Thor made a promise, he kept it. When he hated something, he said so directly. When he fought openly, face to face, no deception or tricks. In a pantheon of schemers and shapeshifters, Thor's straightforwardness was almost radical. His journeys to Jotunheim were legendary, and he made them often. Too often, perhaps, for someone whose official role was protecting Midgard. Thor didn't wait for giants to threaten humanity before hunting them. He sought them out, crossed into their realm, challenged them to combat, and killed them with enthusiasm that suggested sport more than duty. The giants feared him absolutely, which was likely the point. Prevention through intimidation. Keep the frost giants nervous and off balance so they wouldn't dream of attacking Asgard or Midgard. Thor's family centered him in ways combat never could. His wife Sif had hair like spun gold, literally gold, though that was Loki's doing and the story behind it reveals much about Thor's character. One night, as a prank, or perhaps something darker, Loki crept into Thor's hall and cut off all of Sif's hair. When Thor discovered this violation, his rage was apocalyptic. He would have killed Loki immediately, brother of Odin or not, if Loki hadn't talked fast enough to propose a solution. He convinced dwarven craftsmen to forge hair from actual gold, hair that would grow like natural hair, but shine with metal beauty. When attached to Sif's head, the golden hair was even more beautiful than her original locks. Thor forgave Loki, but barely, and the incident established something important. Thor would tolerate many things, but threatening his family crossed a line that even gods shouldn't cross. His children inherited aspects of his nature. Magni and Modi, whose names mean strength and courage, would survive Ragnarok and inherit Mjolnir. His daughter Thrud, whose name means power, was desired by many but belonged to none. Thor's family was not large, not like some gods who fathered children across all 9 realms, but it was solid, unbreakable, as the mountains his hammer could shatter. Thor travelled with 2 goats pulling his chariot, Tangrisnir and Tangnjosta, Teeth-bearer and Teeth-grinder. These weren't ordinary goats. At night, Thor could slaughter them, cook them, eat them. In the morning, he would gather their bones, bless them with Mjolnir, and the goats would resurrect, whole and ready to pull the chariot again. Eternal food source, transportation, and demonstration of Thor's power over death itself, at least for these particular animals. The detail is strange, slightly grotesque, very practical. Thor's relationship with his goats was less sentimental than functional, though he was furious when a human boy accidentally broke one of the bones and the goat resurrected lame. Mortals loved Thor more than any other god. When thunder rolled across the sky, they knew he was near, fighting giants or crossing between realms. When lightning struck, that was Mjolnir finding its target. He was the god they could understand, whose motivations were clear, whose protection was reliable, if somewhat incidental to his personal enjoyment of violence. Thor kept the giants at bay. Whether he did it for humanity's sake or because he enjoyed the fighting is a question the myths never answer clearly. Perhaps it doesn't matter. The result was the same either way. But not all threats to the cosmos came from giants in Jotunheim. Some came from within Asgard itself, from the trickster who walked among gods but never quite belonged to them. Neither god nor giant, neither male nor female, neither villain nor hero. Loki was the crack in reality itself, and through that crack would pour the end of everything. But for a long time, centuries, perhaps millennia, he lived among the Aesir as one of them, almost. Blood brother to Odin, bound by oaths so old they predated most of creation. Companion to Thor on countless adventures. Useful when problems required cunning rather than strength. Yet never quite belonging, never fully trusted, always suspect because his father was the giant Farbauti and his mother was Laufey, which meant giant blood ran through his veins even as he walked Asgard's golden halls. Loki's greatest gift was his shape-shifting. He could become anything, man or woman, young or old, human or animal or something that had never existed before. Gender was costume to him. species a suggestion. This fluidity made him invaluable for schemes that required infiltration or deception, but it also marked him as fundamentally other in a pantheon that valued fixed identities and clear categories. The gods could never be certain who or what Loki really was beneath the shifting forms, and perhaps Loki himself didn't know. His tricks are legendary, though whether they're pranks or malice depends on perspective and outcome. When Asgard needed walls to protect against giants, a builder offered to construct fortifications in impossibly short time in exchange for the sun, moon, and the goddess Freya as payment. The gods agreed, assuming failure was certain, but the builder had a stallion of supernatural strength that hauled stones faster than seemed possible. Panic set in among the Aesir as the deadline approached and the walls neared completion. They turned to Loki. "Fix this," they demanded. "This is your fault for not foreseeing the problem." So Loki transformed into a mare in heat and seduced the builder's stallion, leading it away into the forest. Without his horse, the builder failed to meet the deadline. And months later, Loki returned to Asgard, having given birth to an 8-legged foal that became Sleipnir, Odin's mount. The story is bizarre and uncomfortable, deliberately so. Loki didn't just solve the problem, he became pregnant to do it, crossed boundaries of form and gender that made even gods uneasy. When he cut Sif's hair, it seemed like simple cruelty. But when Thor threatened to break every bone in his body, Loki went to the dwarves and commissioned not just golden hair, but also Gungnir for Odin, and Mjolnir for Thor gifts, that became the gods' most powerful weapons. He created problems, and then fixed them in ways that left the gods better armed, but also more dependent on him, more tied to the trickster they distrusted. The gods used Loki when they needed him. When brute force failed, when treaties required negotiation, when enemies needed to be deceived rather than destroyed, Loki was their tool. But tools that think for themselves are dangerous, and Loki thought constantly, planned elaborately, remembered every slight and every moment when the gods made clear he was useful but not beloved, necessary but not trusted. His wife Sigyn was loyal in ways that defy easy explanation. Why did she stay with him? Love, perhaps, or understanding that the gods' treatment of Loki was creating the very monster they feared. She would prove her loyalty later, in caves of darkness, holding a bowl while poison dripped. But that story comes later. Loki's other family was more complicated. With the giantess Angrboda, he fathered 3 children: Fenrir the wolf, Jörmungandr the serpent, and Hel, who was half corpse. These children were born neither good nor evil, simply born, powerful and strange, and carrying potential that terrified the gods. Prophecy said they would play crucial roles in Ragnarok, would stand against the Aesir when the final battle came, and the gods, believing prophecy, decided to act preemptively. They took Loki's children and punished them for crimes they hadn't committed, for a future that hadn't happened yet. Jörmungandr was thrown into the ocean. Hel was cast into Niflheim and given dominion over the dead. Fenrir was bound with impossible chains after being betrayed. The gods claimed they were preventing disaster, but perhaps they were causing it. Perhaps if they'd raised Loki's children with kindness, those children wouldn't have become the enemies prophecy predicted. Perhaps by fearing the future, the gods ensured it. Was Loki born to be chaos incarnate, or did the gods make him what he became? Did his nature determine his actions, or did their treatment of him, and especially of his children, transform suspicion into rage, isolation into betrayal? The sources don't answer clearly, and maybe that ambiguity is the point. Loki exists in the space between categories, where motivation and action separate, where cause and effect tangle until you can't determine which came first, the gods' fear or the reasons for that fear. What's certain is that Loki's children would remember how they were treated, and when the time came, they would act accordingly. They feared the wolf would devour the world, so they betrayed him, bound him, and left him howling in darkness, never realizing that it was their betrayal that would make the prophecy come true. Or perhaps they did realize, and bound him anyway, because fear makes even gods irrational, makes them choose action over wisdom, prevention over acceptance. Fenrir came to Asgard as a pup, one of Loki's 3 monstrous children. The gods could have killed him then, when he was small and vulnerable. They didn't. Perhaps that was mercy, or perhaps they hoped that raising him among them might change whatever future the prophecies predicted. So the wolf grew up in Asgard, and only Tyr was brave enough to feed him. Tyr, god of law and justice, god of oaths and right action, was the one who approached the growing wolf without visible fear, who brought meat and stayed to ensure the creature ate, who treated Fenrir with something approaching kindness. Fenrir grew, and grew, larger than any natural wolf, stronger than any animal should be, intelligent enough to understand speech and possibly to speak himself, though the sources are unclear. The gods watched him grow, and felt their unease transform into fear. Prophecy said this wolf would kill Odin during Ragnarok. Prophecy said Fenrir's jaws would stretch from earth to sky. Prophecy said many things, and the gods believed them all. So they decided to bind him. For his own safety, they claimed. Just a test of strength, they said. They brought the first chain, lading, heavy iron links forged with standard skill. They challenged Fenrir to let himself be bound, to prove how strong he was by breaking free. Fenrir, still young enough to trust, or at least not to suspect, agreed. The gods wrapped him in chain. Fenrir flexed, and lading shattered. The gods laughed and praised his strength, but their laughter was nervous. They commissioned a stronger chain, Dromi, twice as heavy as lading. Again they challenged Fenrir. Again he agreed, though perhaps he noticed how their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Again he broke free, though this time it required more effort. And Fenrir understood. This wasn't sport. This was testing, preparation for something permanent. The gods feared him. The gods wanted him restrained. But he was Loki's son, and Loki had taught him about suspicion, about reading between words to find intent. The gods went to the dwarves, those master craftsmen who worked in darkness and understood impossible things, and commissioned something unprecedented. Gleipnir, a binding made not from metal or leather, but from things that don't exist. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird, all the impossible elements woven into a ribbon that looked like silk, soft and delicate, but was unbreakable because it was made from absence, from the negative space between what is and what cannot be. The gods brought Gleipnir to Fenrir and challenged him again. But Fenrir had grown wiser along with larger. He looked at the thin ribbon and knew something was wrong. If it was truly weak enough to break, why would the gods bother? And if it was strong enough to hold him, why would he let them bind him with it? He proposed a condition. One of the gods must place their hand in his mouth as pledge of good faith. If the ribbon was truly just a test, if they truly believed he could break free, then there was no risk in the pledge. But if the ribbon held and they'd lied to him, then at least one god would pay for the betrayal with their hand. The gods looked at each other. No one moved. The silence stretched. Finally, Tyr stepped forward. Tyr, who had fed Fenrir since puppyhood, who had shown the wolf more kindness than any other god. He walked to Fenrir and placed his right hand, his sword hand, into the wolf's mouth. Fenrir allowed himself to be bound with Gleipnir. He tested the ribbon, pulled, strained, and discovered it would not break, could not break, that he was held by something stronger than physics, bound by impossibility itself. And he bit down. Tyr's hand came off clean. The god of oaths and justice paid the price for a necessary lie, or perhaps for a terrible truth disguised as game. Fenrir thrashed and howled, but Gleipnir held. The gods drove a sword through the ribbon and into stone, fixing it in place, then propped another sword in Fenrir's jaws to keep them open. His howls echoed across all 9 realms. His drool poured out in rivers, and the gods named that river Van Hope, though what hope existed in a bound wolf's saliva is unclear. Perhaps they meant that Fenrir's binding gave them hope of surviving Ragnarok. Or perhaps they meant that hope itself is just drool from a trapped beast, desperate and ultimately meaningless. Their Fenrir remains, has remained for ages, will remain until the chains that should hold everything together begin to break. Bound on an island, betrayed by the only gods who showed him kindness, growing stronger in rage and patience. Waiting for the appointed time when Gleipnir will snap and his jaws will finally stretch as wide as prophecy promised, when he will hunt across Vigrid Plain, seeking Odin, seeking vengeance, fulfilling the exact doom the gods tried to prevent by creating it. The wolf, who might have been an ally, became the enemy they deserved. He was so perfect that even weapons refused to harm him. And that perfection made the gods forget the oldest truth. In Norse mythology, happiness is always borrowed, and it's always paid back with blood. Balder was the exception that proved every rule, the anomaly in a cosmos built on violence and ambiguity. And that made him beautiful. It also made him doomed. Balder, son of Odin and Frigg, was beloved in ways that defy cynical interpretation. Not respected like Odin, not feared like Thor, not useful like Loki, actually beloved. He was described as the most beautiful of all gods, but the beauty wasn't just physical. He radiated something that even the oldest sources struggle to name: goodness, perhaps, or purity, or the kind of presence that makes everyone around him want to be better than they are. Light followed him, literally or metaphorically, depending on which version you believe. When Balder entered a room, darkness retreated not from fear, but from simple incompatibility with his existence. Everything in Asgard loved him. The other gods, certainly. But also the trees in the gardens, the stones in the walls, the birds in the sky. It wasn't magic or compulsion. It was something stranger and more organic, as if the universe itself recognized Balder as special and responded accordingly. In a pantheon of schemers and warriors and complicated entities with mixed motivations, Balder was straightforward goodness, and that straightforwardness was radical. But Norse mythology doesn't reward purity. It respects cunning and values strength and honors oaths. But unalloyed goodness is treated with suspicion, as if the cosmos knows such things cannot last, should not last, are errors in the natural order that must be corrected. Balder began having dreams. Not normal dreams, but visions heavy with prophecy and dread. In these dreams, he died. Over and over, in different ways, through different means, but always dying, always ending. He woke, disturbed, and his disturbance spread through Asgard, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The gods sensed something fundamental breaking. Balder's dreams weren't just personal nightmares, they were omens, cracks appearing in reality's foundation. Frigg, his mother, refused to accept this. If prophecy said her son would die, she would rewrite prophecy. She would make death itself impossible for Balder through the simple expedient of getting everything in creation to promise not to harm him. It was audacious, perhaps insane, definitely desperate. But Frigg was a goddess and Odin's wife, and when she travelled through the 9 realms demanding oaths, nothing refused her. She went to weapons first, swords, spears, axes, every blade and point, and made them swear. She went to stones and boulders and made them swear. She went to trees and plants and made them swear. She went to animals, to diseases, to metals, to fire and water and earth and air. She travelled through all 9 realms, extracting oaths, building an armour of promises around her son that no physical armour could match. And everything agreed. The universe itself consented to protect Balder. Perhaps because everything loved him as the gods did, or perhaps because refusing Frigg seemed more dangerous than agreeing. Either way, the oaths were made, binding and absolute. When Frigg returned to Asgard and announced her success, the gods celebrated. They'd done the impossible. They'd negated prophecy through determination and comprehensive diplomacy. Balder was safe. Death had been defeated, at least for one god, at least for now. To prove it, to celebrate it, to reassure themselves constantly, the gods made a game. They gathered in the great hall and threw weapons at Balder. Spears bounced off his chest. Axes struck his head and fell harmlessly away. Swords slashed at him and left no mark. The gods laughed as each weapon proved Frigg's oaths held. It became entertainment, spectacle, almost ritual. Every day, the gods would gather and hurl death at Balder, and every day he would stand unharmed while they marvelled at the impossibility made mundane through repetition. There's something disturbing in this celebration, something that speaks to hubris and denial. The gods were whistling past the graveyard, throwing weapons at their beloved companion to prove that death couldn't touch him, never quite acknowledging that the game itself was grotesque. That treating invulnerability as entertainment suggested deep anxiety beneath the laughter. That maybe, subconsciously, they knew the protection was temporary, that they were testing it obsessively because they didn't quite believe it would hold. But consciously, they believed. They had to believe. The alternative that Balder's dreams were still valid, that prophecy couldn't be negated through oaths alone, was too terrible to contemplate. Only one god didn't participate in the games. Hod, Balder's blind brother, stood aside during the weapon throwing, unable to aim, unable to join the celebration of his brother's invulnerability. The sources suggest he was sad about this exclusion, that he wanted to participate in honouring Balder, but couldn't. His blindness made him useless in games that required seeing your target. So he stood at the edge of the gathering, listening to weapons strike, and hearing his brother's laughter and the gods' cheers, and he remained apart. What the gods didn't know, what Frigg hadn't told them, was that her quest through the 9 realms hadn't been quite as comprehensive as she'd claimed. There was one thing she'd overlooked. One plant, small and seemingly harmless, growing on trees rather than from earth, parasitic and young, and so insignificant that Frigg had looked at it and decided it was too weak, too innocent, too trivial to bother with. Mistletoe, the plant that grows between earth and sky, neither tree nor ground plant, with white berries like small moons and leaves that stay green through winter. It seemed harmless. It seemed incapable of threatening anyone, least of all a god protected by the oaths of the entire universe. Frigg's oversight was almost absurd in its specificity. Of everything in creation, one plant remained unsworn, one loophole in the armour of promises, one exception to the universal protection. And in a cosmos where details matter absolutely, where the specific wording of oaths can mean the difference between safety and doom, one exception was enough. The gods continued their games, throwing weapons at Balder, laughing as he stood unharmed. They believed they'd won. They believed prophecy could be outsmarted through sufficient thoroughness and effort. They believed that love and oaths were stronger than fate. They believed wrong. But they wouldn't know that until it was far too late, until the overlooked thing became the instrument of murder, until the game stopped being entertainment and became tragedy. Until Loki, watching from the edges with his predator's attention to weakness, noticed what everyone else had missed. That blind Hod stood alone, wanting to participate but unable, and that somewhere in the 9 realms, one thing remained capable of harming the invulnerable god. One blind throw, one overlooked plant, one refusal to weep. And the brightest light in all the 9 realms was extinguished, and with it went any hope that Ragnarok could be prevented. The machinery of doom that had been building since the gods murdered Ymir began its final acceleration, and the trigger was something as small as a parasitic plant and as large as cosmic inevitability, refusing to be denied. Loki watched the games around Balder with expression that sources describe differently depending on who's telling the story. Some say jealousy twisted his face. Balder was beloved while Loki was useful, and there's a difference that cuts deep. Others suggest resentment at seeing the gods celebrate their victory over prophecy, as if fate could be negotiated away through sufficient effort. But perhaps what Loki felt was something stranger and more theological. Perhaps he saw that Balder's invulnerability broke fundamental rules, that in a cosmos where everything dies, where even Ymir the first being was murdered to build reality, one god, standing immune to death, was an aberration that couldn't be sustained. Whatever motivated him, Loki acted with characteristic cunning. He transformed himself into an old woman, harmless and grandmotherly, and visited Frigg in her hall. They talked of small things, as old women do, and eventually the conversation turned to Balder and his remarkable invulnerability. Loki, still disguised, marvelled at Frigg's accomplishment. Truly everything in creation had sworn not to harm Balder? Truly everything? Frigg, proud of her work, and seeing no harm in confirming it to a curious grandmother, admitted there was one exception. Such a small thing, hardly worth mentioning. A plant called mistletoe, growing west of Valhalla, so young and harmless that she judged it incapable of hurting anyone. Loki left Frigg's hall and went immediately to find the mistletoe. The plant grew as described, innocent and overlooked. Loki cut it carefully, shaped it into a dart or arrow. Sources disagree on the exact form and hardened the point through means the stories don't explain. Magic, perhaps, or simple knowledge of how to make soft things sharp. When he finished, he held in his hand the only weapon in all 9 realms capable of harming Balder. The next gathering of gods found them at their usual entertainment, throwing weapons at the invulnerable god. Loki noticed blind Hod standing apart, as always, unable to participate. He approached Hod with false kindness, asking why he didn't honour his brother by joining the games. Hod explained his blindness made it impossible to aim. Loki offered to help, to guide his hand, to give him a chance to participate in celebrating Balder's protection. He handed Hod the mistletoe dart. He positioned Hod's arm. He aimed for Balder's heart. Hod through. The dart flew true because Loki's guidance was perfect. And the mistletoe, which had sworn no oath, which carried no promise, which existed in the one gap in Frigg's comprehensive protection, pierced Balder through the chest and found his heart and stopped it. The moment of impact stretched. Everything slowed. The laughter in the hall continued for a heartbeat longer than it should have, gods not yet understanding what their eyes were seeing. Then silence crashed down like a physical weight. Balder looked down at the dart in his chest, with expression of confusion more than pain, as if he couldn't quite process that something had finally, impossibly, hurt him. He reached for the mistletoe, touched it, seemed about to speak. Then he fell. The gods rushed to him, called his name, tried to wake him, but Balder was dead. The impossible had happened in the space between one breath and the next. The brightest of the gods lay on the floor of Asgard with a piece of mistletoe through his heart, and nothing in their power could undo it. Grief came first. Frigg's scream echoed across all 9 realms. Odin, who had foreseen so much, looked at his dead son and knew this was the beginning of the ending he'd spent centuries trying to prevent. Thor reached for his hammer, but had no enemy to strike. The gods stood paralyzed by loss and the shattering of certainty. If Balder could die, nothing was safe. No protection was perfect. Fate had won after all. Rage came second. They looked for Loki and found him already fleeing. They wanted to kill him immediately, wanted to tear him apart. But Asgard was sacred ground where violence between gods was forbidden by laws older than any present. Even in rage and grief, some rules held. Hermod, another of Odin's sons, volunteered to ride to Helheim. He took Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse, and rode for 9 nights through valleys so dark and deep that he couldn't see his own hands. He crossed the bridge over the river Gjöll and entered Hel's realm, finding Balder sitting in the place of honor in her hall, already treated as one of the distinguished dead. Hermod begged Hel to release Balder. The gods needed him. Creation needed him. Surely some arrangement could be made, some price paid. Hel, half living and half dead, considered the request with the same dual nature she brought to everything. She agreed to a condition. If every single thing in creation wept for Balder, she would release him. But if even one thing refused to weep, he would remain in Helheim forever. Hermod rode back with this message. The gods sent messengers to all 9 realms asking everything to weep for Balder, and everything did. Humans wept, animals wept, trees wept sap, stones wept moisture. Metals wept rust, fire wept smoke. Even the earth itself wept through springs and streams. The entire universe mourned the death of the god too good to live, and every part of creation shed tears to bring him back. Every part except one. In a cave far from anywhere, the messengers found a giantess named Thök. They asked her to weep for Balder. She refused. "Let Hel keep what she holds," Thök said. "Balder brought me no joy in life. I'll weep no tears for him in death." And the giantess laughed with voice that sounded suspiciously like Loki's. Because of one refusal, Balder remained dead. One creature refusing to weep was enough to break the condition, to keep the brightest god in the realm of shadows forever. The sources strongly suggest Thök was Loki in disguise, that he murdered Balder, and then ensured Balder stayed murdered, doubling his betrayal, making certain the one good thing in Norse mythology could never return. Balder's death was more than tragedy. It was transformation. The moment the mistletoe pierced his heart, the countdown to Ragnarok truly began. The end was no longer distant possibility but approaching certainty. And the gods, who had tried so hard to prevent it, had through their own actions binding Fenrir, imprisoning Loki's children, overlooking one plant, ensured it would come exactly as prophesied. He'd outwitted gods and giants for millennia, but when the All-Father himself hunts you, there's nowhere left to hide. Not in any of the 9 realms, not even wearing another form. Loki knew this. He'd always known this. Yet he ran anyway, because running was what you did when the alternative was facing the rage of gods who had just lost the one thing in creation they all agreed was worth protecting. After Balder fell and the mistletoe's secret was revealed, Loki fled Asgard, before the sacred prohibitions against violence could be tested past their breaking point. He ran to the edges of civilization, to mountains where gods rarely travelled, and there he built a house. Not a comfortable dwelling, but a strategic position, a watchtower disguised as shelter. 4 doors, each facing a cardinal direction, so he could see anyone approaching from any angle. Inside, he sat and thought and planned, with the frantic energy of someone who knows they're delaying the inevitable rather than preventing it. He thought about how the gods might catch him, what methods they might use, what tricks they might employ. In his paranoia and his genius, he invented something new, a fishing net, woven from cord in a pattern that would trap fish by allowing water through, but blocking anything larger. He studied his invention, admired its cleverness, then realized with creeping horror that if he could think of it, the gods might think of it too. If Odin glimpsed this net from his all-seeing throne, the gods would have the very tool they needed to catch a shapeshifter. So Loki threw the net into his fire and watched it burn to ash. He thought he'd destroyed the idea along with the object, but Odin had already seen it. The Allfather's gaze had passed over that mountain house at the exact moment Loki held his invention, and the pattern was recorded in Odin's mind, waiting to be reconstructed. When Loki saw the gods approaching from all four directions, simultaneously saw them through his four doors, saw their determination, saw that his time had run out, he did the only thing left to him. He transformed into a salmon and leaped into the river that ran past his house, swimming toward a waterfall where the churning water might hide him, where the chaos of falling water might mask his presence from even Odin's sight. The gods entered Loki's empty house and found the ashes of the burned net still warm in the fireplace. Odin stared at those ashes and saw the pattern, understood immediately what Loki had invented and why he'd destroyed it. The gods reconstructed the net from memory, weaving it exactly as Loki had designed it, using his own innovation as the weapon to catch him. They dragged the net through the river. Loki, in salmon form, felt it coming and swam desperately ahead of it, staying just beyond its reach. The gods pulled the net to shore empty and started again, weighting it this time so it would drag along the river bottom, giving the salmon nowhere to hide beneath it. Loki felt the net approaching again, felt it scraping the riverbed, cutting off his escape downward. At the last moment, he gathered all his strength and leaped, jumping over the net in a silver arc of water and scales and desperation. The gods saw the salmon jump. They repositioned, dragged the net again, herding Loki toward the waterfall. Once more he had to choose be caught by the net or leap over it. He leaped again, higher this time, and Thor was waiting. The thunder god's hand shot out mid-leap and caught the salmon by its tail, gripping tight despite the fish's thrashing. Loki's shapeshifting was powerful, but not powerful enough to change forms while being held by Thor's strength. The salmon's tail compressed under Thor's grip, and ever since or so the story claims all salmon have had tapered tails, carrying the mark of the moment Loki was finally caught. Loki transformed back to his own shape, dripping and defeated. The gods showed him no mercy. They dragged him to a cave deep underground, a place where screams would echo but never reach the surface. They brought Loki's sons, Nafi and Vali, innocent children who had done nothing except be born to the wrong father. What happened next crosses from justice into atrocity. The gods transformed Vali into a wolf, stripping away his humanity and his reason, turning him into something that acted on instinct rather than love. And Wolf Vali, no longer recognizing his brother, attacked Nafi, tore him apart while Loki screamed and fought his captors, and could do nothing except watch his son murdered by his other son, watch his family destroyed as punishment for his crime. They took Nafi's intestines, his own son's entrails, still warm, and used them to bind Loki across 3 stone slabs. They wrapped the intestines around his limbs and torso and tied them tight, and through some divine magic or some property of grief made tangible, the soft organs hardened into something stronger than iron, unbreakable and eternal. Loki lay bound by his son's body, transformed into chains. Vali presumably fled into wilderness, still in wolf form, carrying the weight of fratricide he hadn't chosen and couldn't prevent. One son dead, one son lost to animal nature. And Loki, who had caused so much chaos and solved so many problems, who had helped the gods and betrayed them, lay imprisoned in darkness with only his rage and his grief, and the knowledge that his punishment had barely begun. The gods weren't finished. Binding him was not enough. They wanted him to suffer as Balder had suffered, as they themselves were suffering. So they added one more element to Loki's torture, one more piece to ensure his imprisonment would be agony rather than mere restraint. And that element would require the loyalty of the one person who loved him despite everything he'd become. For millennia she sat in darkness holding a bowl, catching poison to spare her husband's face, never knowing that her devotion would be repaid with her sitting beside him when he burns the world. Or perhaps she did know, and stayed anyway, because love in Norse mythology is not about happy endings, but about choosing your companion for the journey into darkness. Sigyn, wife of Loki, came to the cave after the gods had finished their work. She saw her husband bound across 3 stone slabs, with their son's intestines hardened to iron. She saw what remained of Nafi, saw what had become of Vali. She saw everything the gods had done, and she didn't flee. She didn't rage at Loki for the choices that had brought them to this moment. She simply took her place beside him and prepared to stay. The gods weren't finished with their punishment. They brought a serpent, venomous, eternal, patient, and fixed it to the cave ceiling directly above Loki's face. The serpent's fangs dripped poison, burning venom that could melt stone, that could eat through metal, that caused agony beyond any physical pain when it touched divine flesh. The gods positioned it carefully so the drops would fall directly onto Loki's face, into his eyes, onto his lips, ensuring maximum suffering. But they hadn't accounted for Sigyn. Or perhaps they had, and her presence was part of the punishment, not just for Loki but for her, forcing her to choose between abandoning her husband or spending eternity in a cave performing an impossible task. She chose the cave. She took a bowl. Sources don't say where she got it. Perhaps she brought it with her. Perhaps she found it there, and she held it above Loki's face to catch the poison before it could fall on him. Drop by drop, the venom filled the bowl. Drop by drop, she spared him the agony the gods intended. And she sat there, in darkness, listening to the serpent's hissing and Loki's breathing and the slow drip of poison into her bowl. Time passed. Days became weeks, became years, became centuries, became millennia. Sigyn sat. The bowl filled. And when it filled completely, she had to turn away to empty it. And in those moments, seconds perhaps, or minutes, however long it took to pour the venom out and return the bowl to position the poison dripped onto Loki's face. When the venom hit him, Loki's convulsions were so violent that the earth itself shook. In Midgard, humans felt earthquakes and didn't know they were feeling a god's agony, a bound trickster thrashing against chains made from his dead son's body, poison burning his divine flesh. The convulsions were involuntary, total, the kind of pain that strips away consciousness and leaves only raw animal reaction. And when they passed, when Sigyn returned the bowl to position and caught the poison again, Loki would lie still and gather himself and wait for the next time. Why did she stay? The sources don't explain, and perhaps that's because the question is too human for mythology to answer clearly. Love seems too simple. Duty feels insufficient. Some suggest she stayed from denial, believing that if she remained loyal enough, patient enough, devoted enough, somehow this would end differently than everyone knew it would. Others propose she understood something deeper, that by staying, she was bearing witness, ensuring Loki wasn't alone in his suffering, maintaining the last thread of connection between the trickster and anything resembling compassion or humanity. Or perhaps she stayed because leaving would mean accepting that everything, their marriage, their children, their life together, had led inevitably to this cave and this punishment, and acceptance was more terrible than endurance. The cave itself was darkness made tangible. Cold seeped from stone walls that never saw sun. The only sounds were the serpent's hissing, the drip of venom into Sigyn's bowl, Loki's occasional movements against his bonds, and very rarely, their voices when they spoke to each other in words the myths don't record. What do you say to your husband bound by your dead son's intestines while poison drips on his face? What does he say to you while you hold a bowl for millennia? The myths preserve the image but not the words, leaving their conversation to darkness and imagination. Loki's mental state during this imprisonment was not what the gods perhaps hoped for. They wanted repentance, remorse, the breaking of his will. What they got was concentration. Loki lay in darkness and thought. Planned, calculated. Every drop of poison that hit his face when Sigyn turned away was a reminder of why he would have his revenge. Every moment, bound by Nafi's transformed body, was fuel for the rage that would eventually burn 9 realms. He didn't despair. Despair requires hopelessness, and Loki knew exactly when his hope would arrive. Ragnarok was coming. The bonds would break. The prophecies would fulfill themselves despite, or perhaps because of everything the gods had done to prevent them. Fenrir waited, bound like his father. Jormungandr circled the world, patient. Hel ruled her realm of the dead. and Loki lay in his cave, counting down to the moment when everything the gods had built would burn. The relationship between Sigyn and Loki in that cave was mythology's strangest devotion. Her loyalty without limits, his vengeance without hesitation. She held the bowl. He planned apocalypse. She protected him from poison. He prepared to destroy everything she'd known. Perhaps she was the last piece of humanity Loki possessed, the final connection to anything besides rage and revenge. Perhaps when he finally broke free and emerged from that cave to lead armies against Asgard, he would leave that humanity behind with her, sitting in eternal darkness, still holding an empty bowl. The imprisonment was not permanent. Everyone knew this. The bonds would hold until they didn't. Sigyn would catch the poison until she couldn't. And when that moment came, when Ragnarok's chains began breaking, Loki would rise from his cave with millennia of suffering converted into purpose, and nothing would stop what came next. 3 winters came without summer between them, and in that endless cold, everything humans believed about goodness and kinship froze and shattered. And in Asgard, the gods buckled their armor and waited for the inevitable. The Fimbul winter had begun, and with it came the unraveling of everything that had been built from Ymir's murdered body. The first winter was harsh, but not unprecedented. Midgard had known hard winters before, seasons when snow piled high and cold bit deep, and survival required all of humanity's accumulated wisdom about endurance. People rationed food and huddled close, and told themselves that spring would come, as it always had, that this was simply a test, that the cycles they'd depended on for generations would continue. But spring didn't come. Instead came another winter, flowing directly from the first, without pause or transition. No thaw, no greening, no relief. Just cold building on cold, snow accumulating on snow, ice thickening until rivers froze solid to their beds. Crops that hadn't been planted couldn't grow. Animals that had survived the first winter died in the second. Food stores that had seemed adequate for one hard season proved desperately insufficient for 2. Then the third winter came, colder than the second, darker than the first. And humanity understood that this wasn't aberration but transformation, that the world itself was changing into something that could no longer support life as they'd known it. The sun, which had grown dimmer through the first 2 winters, now seemed almost extinguished. It rose weakly and set quickly, providing light but no warmth, illumination without comfort. Starvation came first. Then came what starvation always brings: the breakdown of everything civilization had built to keep humans human. The prophecy had specific language about this part, words that had been spoken for centuries but only now showed their full meaning. Brother will fight brother, sisters' sons will slay each other. Fathers and sons will come to strife. The bonds of family, which had been the foundation of human society, frayed and snapped under the pressure of survival. People killed their neighbors for food. Sons murdered fathers for inheritance that would last another week. Brothers went to war over territories that were equally frozen, equally useless, but represented the only possible chance at survival. Women abandoned children they couldn't feed. Children betrayed parents, who had become liabilities rather than protectors. Every value that had seemed permanent revealed itself as contingent, dependent on surplus and safety that the Fimbul winter had stripped away. This wasn't just weather. It wasn't simply an extended cold spell that would eventually pass. The Fimbul winter was the universe dying, the cosmos beginning its dissolution. The cold came from Niflheim, from that primordial realm of ice that had existed before creation. As if the ancient ice was reclaiming what had been borrowed from it, taking back the warmth that had allowed life to flourish in Ymir's flesh. The world built from the murdered giant's body was remembering that it was built on death, and death was asserting its priority. The sky itself began to fail. Skirl and Hati, the wolves who had chased the sun and moon since the moment of their creation, running eternally behind their prey, finally closed the distance. Perhaps the celestial bodies had grown weaker, slower, tired from their eternal flight. Perhaps the wolves had grown stronger, more determined, fed by the general dissolution of order. Either way, the chase that had structured time itself came to its inevitable conclusion. Skirl caught the sun. The wolf's jaws closed around the burning orb, and the light went out. Not gradually, not with warning. One moment the dim sun crossed the sky. The next moment, darkness. Total, complete. The kind of darkness that had not existed since before Ymir, since before creation, since the void itself dreamed the first possibilities. Hati caught the moon moments later. The gentler light that had governed night, that had given darkness its own beauty and navigation, its own logic, was swallowed. No sun, no moon. No light except what humans could make themselves from fires that seemed pitiful and small against the cosmic darkness pressing in from all sides. Stars began to fall, not metaphorically. Actual stars tearing loose from their fixed positions in Ymir's skull, plummeting through the space between sky and earth, burning as they fell. Each falling star was a reminder that the firmament itself was coming apart, that the architecture holding reality together was failing at its fundamental joints. The earth shook constantly, no longer just when Loki convulsed under Poison's touch, but continuously now, tremors and quakes that knocked down what structures humans had managed to build, that opened crevasses in frozen ground, that suggested the land itself was trying to tear apart or fold back into the void it had been shaped from. Mountains, those broken bones of Ymir, began crumbling. Cliffs collapsed. The geological features that had seemed permanent for all of human history revealed themselves as temporary arrangements of matter waiting for sufficient force to scatter them. Yggdrasil shook. The world tree that connected all 9 realms, that had stood since before the gods, began to tremble. Its branches that reached through different dimensions of reality started to wither. Its leaves fell like snow, adding to the accumulation of endings. Below, in Niflheim's darkest depths, Nidhogg gnawed at the roots with renewed ferocity. The dragon who had been chewing for eons sensed that the time was finally right, that the tree was weak enough now, that the work of ages was approaching completion. In Midgard, humans looked at the darkness and the cold and the stars falling, and they knew. Most didn't understand the full cosmology, didn't know about Ymir or Loki or the binding of Fenrir, but they understood on a fundamental level that this was ending. Not just winter, not just hard times, everything. The world itself was terminating, and there would be no spring after this, no recovery, no return to how things had been. In Asgard, the gods armed themselves, not with hope, but with grim determination. They had known this moment was coming since Odin drank from Mimir's well and saw the future. They had prepared the Einherjar, gathered their weapons, made their alliances, but knowing doom approaches and facing it are different experiences, and even gods could feel the weight of certain death pressing down like the eternal winter pressing down on Midgard. Odin looked out from Hlithskjalf and saw the darkness consuming all 9 realms. Thor gripped Mjolnir and waited for enemies he could finally fight. Tyr flexed his remaining hand and remembered Fenrir, remembered that the wolf he'd fed as a pup would soon break free to kill them all. The gods did not speak of hope. They spoke of duty and honor and fighting well, even in a battle already lost. The Fimbulwinter was not the end. It was the announcement that the end had begun. The bonds broke not one by one but all together, as if the universe itself took a breath and exhaled doom. And across the 9 realms, monsters long imprisoned began their final march. What had been held by magic and force and desperate hope all failed at once, and the things the gods had feared most began moving toward the confrontation that had been written in prophecy since before any of them were born. In his cave beneath the world, Loki felt the restraints weaken. The intestines that had been his son Nafi's body, hardened into iron chains through divine curse, began to soften. Perhaps they rotted, flesh remembering it was flesh despite millennia of acting as metal. Perhaps the earthquakes that Loki's own convulsions had caused finally stressed the bonds past their tolerance. Perhaps it was simply time, the appointed hour when nothing could hold any more because Ragnarok required these pieces to move into position. The chains snapped. Loki stood for the first time in ages uncountable, his body remembering freedom, his mind already calculating routes and strategies and revenges. He looked at Sigyn, still sitting with her bowl, and perhaps he spoke to her. Perhaps he offered her a place beside him in what came next. Or perhaps he simply walked out of the cave without looking back, leaving her in the darkness that had been her home for so long that light would be stranger than shadow. The myths don't tell us what Sigyn chose. Whether she followed her husband into Ragnarok or remained in the empty cave, still holding the bowl by habit, waiting for poison that would never fall again, both endings are tragic enough to be true. Simultaneously, In another place of binding, Gleipnir finally failed. The magical ribbon made from impossible things, the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain had held Fenrir since the gods betrayed him. But impossibility has limits, and those limits were reached. The ribbon frayed. The wolf, who had been pulling against his restraints for eons, felt them give. The sword that had propped his jaws open shattered like ice, and Fenrir's mouth closed and then opened wider than it had ever been allowed to open, jaws stretching until they reached from earth to sky, exactly as prophecy had always claimed they would. His howl was not triumph. It was rage and pain, and the accumulated suffering of centuries bound in darkness, betrayed by the only god who had shown him kindness. The howl echoed across all 9 realms, through dimensions and between worlds, and everything that heard it understood that the wolf was free and nothing could put him back in chains. Fenrir began to move, and where he walked, the earth cracked under his weight. In the ocean surrounding Midgard, Jörmungandr released the tail he had been biting for millennia. The world serpent had grown so large that its body formed a complete circle around the earth, and maintaining that circle had required it to grip its own tail in its mouth. Now it let go. The serpent's body thrashed as circulation returned to portions that had been held static. The ocean, which had been relatively calm despite the Fimbulwinter's cold, suddenly churned into chaos. Tsunamis radiated from Jörmungandr's movements. Waves taller than mountains crashed into coastlines, drowning what little remained of human civilization. The serpent began swimming toward land, toward the place where gods and giants would meet, its poison dripping from fangs large enough to impale mountains. Every movement of its massive coils sent more water flooding over land, blurring the boundary between sea and shore. In Helheim, in the harbour of the dead, a ship began to move. Naglfar, constructed entirely from the fingernails and toenails of dead humans who had been buried without proper trimming. For centuries, every untrimmed nail had contributed to this ship's construction, molecule by molecule, keratin accumulating into hull and mast and rigging. The ship was grotesque in its composition but magnificent in its size, large enough to carry armies, built from death itself to carry death to the gods. Loki emerged from his cave and made his way to Helheim, to the ship that had been built during his imprisonment, perhaps built for him specifically. He took the helm. Around him gathered the dishonourable dead, those who had not died in battle, who had not been chosen for Valhalla, who had languished in Hell's grey halls waiting for purpose. They boarded Naglfar, an army of the forgotten and the damned, and Loki steered the ship toward the surface world, toward Asgard, toward vengeance. From the south, from Muspelheim, where fire had burned since before creation, came movement of a different kind. Surtur, first and greatest of the fire giants, lifted his flaming sword for the first time since the worlds were built. He had been waiting patient as stone, certain as mathematics for this moment. Around him gathered his people, beings of living flame who had never accepted the god's dominion, who remembered when fire and ice were all that existed, and this complicated cosmos built from Ymir's corpse was an aberration to be corrected. Surtur led his army northward. Where they walked, the ground burned. Trees that had survived the Fimbulwinter ignited spontaneously. Rock melted into lava. The fire giants were not invading so much as reclaiming, taking back the universe from the gods who had stolen it, returning creation to the elemental simplicity from which it should never have emerged. All these forces converged. From below came Loki and the dead. From the edges came Fenrir and Jörmungandr. From the south came Surtur and fire. From Jotunheim came the frost giants, those who had survived Ymir's murder and remembered. They came not as villains but as aggrieved parties, beings wronged by the gods' original violence, entities who had been pushed to the edges of creation and now returned to reclaim the centre. Bifrost, the rainbow bridge connecting Midgard to Asgard, began to glow not with its usual gentle spectrum but with heat. Surtur's approach was warming it, weakening it. Soon it would burn. Soon the gods would have no escape route. Soon everything the Aesir had built would have nowhere to run except toward the battle they had always known was coming. The monsters were awake, the prisoners were free, and they were all moving in the same direction, drawn by destiny and prophecy, and the simple logic that some things, once broken, cannot be repaired. They can only be witnessed as they fall completely apart. 120 leagues of empty plain, more than enough room for gods and monsters to enact the end of everything. Vigrid stretched in all directions, flat and featureless, as if the universe had cleared a stage specifically for this final performance. No trees to provide cover, no hills to offer tactical advantage. Just open space where forces that had been building toward collision for eons could finally meet without obstruction or excuse. On one side of the plain gathered the gods of Asgard. Odin stood at their center, one-eyed and grim, wearing armor that had been prepared for this moment since he first drank from Mimir's well and saw what was coming. Thor stood beside him, Mjolnir in hand, eager despite knowing the prophecies. Tyr was there with his remaining hand. Freya was there without his sword, having given it away long ago for love. Heimdall was there, having blown the horn that summoned everyone to this place. And behind the gods marched the Einherjar, hundreds of thousands of chosen warriors who had died in Midgard and been training in Valhalla for exactly this battle. They marched through the 540 doors of Odin's hall, 800 warriors abreast through each door simultaneously, an army that should have been invincible if sheer numbers and skill could determine victory. But across the plain gathered forces that numbers and skill could not answer. Loki stood at the helm of Naglfar, the ship of fingernails and toenails, surrounded by the dishonorable dead who had nothing to lose because they'd already lost everything. Fenrir was there, jaws stretching from earth to sky, eyes burning with the accumulated rage of centuries bound in darkness. Jormungandr was there, coiled and massive, poison dripping from fangs that could pierce mountains. Surtur was there at the head of his fire giants, sword blazing with flames that had burned since before creation. And the frost giants of Jotunheim were there, finally united, descendants of Ymir come to avenge their progenitor's murder. This was not a battle between good and evil. The gods were not purely righteous, and the forces opposing them were not purely wicked. This was a battle between order and chaos, between the world as it had been built and the raw materials demanding to reclaim their original form, between those who wanted existence to continue in structured complexity and those who wanted to return everything to elemental simplicity, between Ymir's murderers and Ymir's children, between the future that had been forced into being and the past that refused to stay buried. The air between the two armies crackled, not with electricity but with something deeper, the tension of prophecy about to be fulfilled, of destiny reaching its appointed moment, of threads woven since the beginning of time finally pulling tight. Everyone on that plain understood that what happened next had been written long ago. The outcome was not in doubt. The prophecies were clear and specific about who would kill whom, about which gods would fall and which monsters would triumph before falling themselves. Yet they gathered anyway. The gods buckled armor and raised weapons despite knowing they would die. The monsters prepared to charge despite knowing they would not survive their victories. Because Norse mythology is not about winning. It's about meeting your fate with eyes open, about fighting even when fighting is futile, about choosing how you die since you cannot choose whether you die. Heimdall raised Gjallarhorn to his lips and blew. The sound was not music but announcement, declaration, the audible manifestation of inevitability. It echoed across all 9 realms simultaneously, through dimensions and between worlds. It woke the dead who were still in Helheim, who would remain there as witnesses to what came next. It reached the remaining humans huddled in darkness and cold, and they understood that the gods themselves were about to die, and there would be nothing left to protect humanity from the chaos that would follow. Before the charge began, Odin took one final moment. He called for Mimir's head, that preserved consciousness that had advised him since the gods murdered Ymir. One last consultation. One final attempt to find some wisdom that might change what everyone knew was coming. The head spoke, but the myths don't record what it said. Perhaps it offered no secret strategy, no hidden escape route, no clever loophole in prophecy. Perhaps it simply confirmed what Odin already knew. This is how it ends. This is what happens when you build a world on murder. This is the price of that first violence, echoing through time until it consumes everything. Odin lowered the head. He looked across Vigrid Plain at the forces gathered against him. He saw Fenrir, the wolf he had betrayed. He saw Loki, his blood brother turned enemy. He saw the giants whose progenitor he had killed. He saw Surtur with fire that would erase everything he'd built. And he gave the signal. Both sides charged. The distance between them collapsed. The moment that had been approaching since Ginnungagap first stirred, since fire met ice, since the gods chose violence as their answer to chaos, finally arrived. The sound of collision was the sound of reality breaking. And across Vigrid Plain, gods and monsters met in battle, each fulfilling the role that had been written for them in the stars that were now falling from the sky. God by god, monster by monster, they fell. Not in glory, not in defeat, but in fulfillment of words spoken before time began. Each death was a prophecy kept, a promise made to fate and honoured with blood. The battlefield became a catalogue of endings, each one written long ago, each one arriving exactly when and how it was supposed to. Odin found Fenrir on the field, or perhaps Fenrir found Odin. The distinction hardly mattered. The Allfather, who had drunk from wells of wisdom and hung from the world tree and sacrificed his eye to see the future, faced the wolf he had betrayed and bound. He knew what was coming, had known for centuries, had seen this exact moment in Mimir's well and prepared for it anyway, gathering armies and forging alliances and doing everything possible to survive what could not be survived. Fenrir's jaws stretched from earth to sky, exactly as prophecy had always claimed. The wolf, who had been bound as a pup, who had trusted Tyr enough to accept chains, who had spent eons in darkness, with a sword propping his mouth open, finally got to close his jaws on the one responsible for it all. Odin, Allfather, god of wisdom and war and death, was swallowed whole, not torn apart, not fought to exhaustion, simply consumed, taken into darkness by the wolf he had created through betrayal. But Fenrir's triumph lasted only moments. Vidar, Odin's son, stepped forward. He wore on one foot a shoe that had been in preparation since the world was young, constructed from every scrap of leather ever discarded by human cobblers, every trimming and leftover piece, accumulated over centuries into a shoe of impossible strength. Vidar stepped into Fenrir's lower jaw, the shoe protecting his foot from the wolf's teeth, and he reached up with his hands and gripped the upper jaw, and he tore. The wolf, who could not be bound by chains, who had broken Gleipnir and shattered swords, was torn apart from the inside by a god wearing a shoe made from waste. Odin was avenged. But Odin remained dead, and Vidar's vengeance changed nothing about the outcome written in prophecy. Thor found Jormungandr where the world serpent had come to land, massive coils churning the earth where they'd previously churned ocean. These two had history. Thor had tried to kill the serpent before, had pulled it from the ocean during a fishing trip, only to have his giant companion cut the line from fear. Now there would be no interruption, no intervention, no line to cut. This was the final meeting that both had known would come. Thor swung Mjolnir with all the strength that had made him the strongest of the Aesir. The hammer connected with Jormungandr's skull and crushed it. The serpent, Loki's child who had grown large enough to circle the world, died from that blow. But dying and dead are different states, and in the space between them, Jormungandr had time for one final act. The serpent opened its mouth and sprayed Thor with venom, poison concentrated from millennia of accumulation, toxic enough to kill even the god of thunder. Thor staggered back. 9 steps he took, each step away from the serpent's corpse, each step slower than the last. On the 9th step he fell, poisoned, victorious, and dead simultaneously. The protector of Midgard had killed his ancient enemy, but would not survive to protect anything else. Tyr met Garm, the monstrous hound who had guarded Helheim's gates. The god who had fed Fenrir as a pup, who had sacrificed his sword hand to bind the wolf, faced a different beast now. They fought with the brutal efficiency of beings who existed for specific purposes. No speeches, no dramatic flourishes, just combat that ended with both of them dying from wounds the other had inflicted. The god of law and oaths and the hound of death fell together, and neither would rise. Heimdall and Loki found each other on the battlefield as if drawn by magnetism, two figures who had always been opposites and mirrors simultaneously. Heimdall, who guarded Bifrost and saw everything approaching. Loki, who slipped past guards and became anything. They had hated each other with the special intensity reserved for those who understand each other too well. Their duel was vicious and personal, and it ended the only way it could with both of them dead, having killed each other, neither able to claim victory because victory required surviving. Freya faced Surtur on that burning field, and everyone watching knew how this would end. Freya had given away his sword long ago to win Gertha, the giant maiden he loved. That choice, made in passion and youth, now determined his fate. He fought Surtur with whatever he could find, but nothing matches a flaming sword wielded by the first of the fire giants. Surtur cut Freya down, and the god of fertility and prosperity fell to the god of burning and ending. All across Vigrid Plain, the dying continued. Einherjar fought frost giants, gods battled monsters. The worthy dead proved their worth by dying again, this time permanently. And slowly, inexorably, the battlefield filled with corpses from both sides, until it became clear that this was not a battle anyone was winning. This was mutual annihilation, the universe committing suicide, order and chaos destroying each other with equal thoroughness. The prophecies were being fulfilled word by word, death by death. And only Surtur remained standing, sword still burning, ready to complete what everyone else had started. Surtur didn't burn the world with hatred but with purpose. He was erasing an error, returning the universe to the void it should never have left. The fire giant stood alone on Vigrid Plain, surrounded by corpses of gods and monsters who had killed each other, fulfilling prophecies. And he raised his flaming sword, the sword he had carried since before Ymir died, since before the cosmos was arranged into 9 realms, and he set everything on fire. The burning was not quick, it was thorough. Surtur did not race through the realms, leaving scorched remnants. He burned methodically, completely, ensuring that nothing of the ordered world would remain. He started with Asgard, because Asgard had always been the symbol of divine order, the fortress built on the foundation of Ymir's murder, the gleaming centre from which the gods had imposed their will on chaos. The golden halls collapsed. Metal melted and ran like water, pooling in the streets before evaporating into nothing. Valhalla, where the Einherjar had trained for this final battle, burned with particular intensity. The bodies of gods and chosen warriors who had already fallen in combat burned alongside the structure itself. 540 doors leading nowhere now, all leading only into flame. Odin's throne, Halith's Jalf, from which the Allfather had watched all 9 realms, burned and fell and was consumed. Bifrost had already burned when the fire giants crossed it. Now Surtur ensured no trace remained, not even ash. The rainbow bridge that connected divine and mortal realms dissolved into its component colours, and those colours dissolved into heat, and that heat joined the general conflagration. Midgard burned next. The forests that had died during Fimbulwinter now burned with unexpected fury, as if the frozen trees had been waiting to combust. The few humans who had survived the 3 winters now died in fire, which was perhaps mercy compared to slow starvation and cold. Their settlements, their fields, their monuments to civilization all burned. The oceans boiled, steam rising to join the smoke, already filling the space where sky had been. Mountains, those broken bones of Ymir, melted back into magma. The earth itself burned, Ymir's flesh returning to the elemental state it had been stolen from. Jotunheim burned. Helheim burned. Niflheim's ice, which had existed since before existence was properly named, melted and evaporated. Muspelheim's fire intensified, as if recognizing kindred force, joining Surtur's flames in consuming everything. The 9 realms that had been arranged like ornaments on Yggdrasil's branches all burned simultaneously, dimensions collapsing into each other as the structure that separated them failed. Yggdrasil itself caught fire. The world tree that had stood since before the gods, that connected all realms, that was possibly more ancient than time, burned like any other wood. Its leaves had already fallen during Fimbulwinter. Now its branches burned away, dimension by dimension. The tree's trunk burned from all sides, and as it burned, the architecture of reality dissolved. The 9 realms, no longer held in place by Yggdrasil's structure, began falling into each other, merging, becoming indistinguishable. Nidhogger, who had gnawed the tree's roots for eons, finally got what it had been working toward the tree's destruction. But whether the dragon survived to see its work completed or died in the flames consuming everything is a question the myths don't answer. Perhaps it doesn't matter. The tree fell, one way or another. All things that stood fell. This was not punishment. This was not cleansing. This was termination, pure and thorough. The universe built from Ymir's murdered corpse was being returned to its raw materials. Order was being dissolved back into chaos. The complex was being reduced to the simple. And as the flames consumed everything, they revealed a truth the gods had perhaps understood, but never accepted. The ordered cosmos was always temporary, always borrowed time, Always an interruption in entropy's natural dominance. Creation had been an accident. The collision of fire and ice in Ginnungagap, the emergence of Ymir, the god's decision to murder the first being and build worlds from the corpse, all of it was deviation from the universe's default state. And now the universe was correcting itself, returning to equilibrium, erasing the anomaly. The earth sank into the sea, or perhaps the sea rose over the earth. The distinction became meaningless, as both land and water dissolved into steam and then into nothing. Stars that had already fallen from Ymir's skull now extinguished completely, not falling anymore because there was nowhere left to fall to. The sky that had been Ymir's skull cracked and shattered and dispersed. The clouds that had been Ymir's brain evaporated. Everything dissolved. Fire and water and earth and air all mixed and merged and cancelled each other out until only void remained. Ginnungagap, the yawning abyss that had existed before creation, the gap that had dreamed the universe into being through the collision of fire and ice. Ginnungagap returned. The circle closed. Beginning and ending met and recognized each other as the same location viewed from different temporal directions. Silence fell. Not the silence of quiet, but the silence of absence. No sound because there was nothing left to make sound, and no space for sound to travel through. The universe had been and now was not. Suta's work was complete. The error had been erased. And yet, when the earth rose green from the sea, when the survivors emerged from hiding, they found a world without masters, without prophecy, without doom, and the terrible freedom to choose what comes next. The void had dreamed again, or perhaps the void had simply paused in its dreaming, and in that pause something new emerged from the ashes of everything that had burned. The fires cooled, the floods receded, and impossibly, inexplicably, the earth rose from the ocean that had swallowed it. Not the same earth, not Ymir's murdered flesh, reconstituted. Something new, or perhaps something very old that had been buried beneath Ymir's corpse and was now finally exposed. Green land emerging from grey water, fertile and unscarred, as if Ragnarok had been surgery removing diseased tissue and revealing healthy growth beneath. From the forest of Hodmimis, from the one place Surtur's fire had not reached for reasons the myths don't explain, emerged two humans, Lif and Lifthrasir, life and eager for life. A woman and a man who had hidden among the trees during the destruction, who had survived on morning dew while the world burned around them, who had waited in that protected grove while gods and monsters killed each other and fire consumed 9 realms. They walked out into the new world and saw that they were alone. Not the last humans, they were the only humans, the entire species compressed into 2 people who carried within them the memory of what had been and the potential for what might come. They had knowledge the first humans hadn't possessed. They knew about gods and giants, about the price of order built on murder, about how civilizations rise and fall and burn. They knew, because they had hidden and survived, what happens when the powerful fight among themselves and drag everything into their battles. Would that knowledge make them wiser? Or would they repeat the same patterns, build the same structures that would eventually require the same destruction? The myths don't answer, because the answer hasn't happened yet, because the new world is possibility rather than certainty. But humans were not the only survivors. Gods returned too, though not the gods who had died. Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, had survived the battle itself. They walked across Vigrid Plain, now empty and silent, and continued walking until they reached where Asgard had stood. Nothing remained of the golden halls except foundations and the faintest outlines showing where walls had been. The fortress built on murder's foundation had burned completely, and what remained was just another patch of earth, neither sacred nor cursed, simply present. Modi and Magni, Thor's sons, found them there. Between them they carried Mjolnir, the hammer their father had wielded, somehow intact despite everything that had burned. The weapon that could shatter mountains had survived the shattering of the world. Perhaps it would be needed again. Perhaps it would remain an artifact, a reminder of strength that hadn't been enough to prevent doom. Hoenir was there too, the god the Aesir had sent to Vanaheim as hostage, who had survived that war and now survived this ending. His presence suggested that indecisiveness, that quality of not committing fully to any position, might be its own kind of survival strategy. The passionate die, the committed fall, The uncertain sometimes endure by never standing firmly enough in one place to be easily struck down. And then came the impossible return. From Helheim, from the realm of death that had presumably burned along with everything else, came Balder and Hod. Brothers who had been separated by murder and darkness, reunited now in a world that had been scoured clean. Balder's death had triggered the countdown to Ragnarok. His return suggested that Ragnarok had reset something fundamental, had undone bindings not just of Loki and Fenrir but of death itself, at least for some. The surviving gods, and they were gods still, though diminished, though without the old hierarchies and authorities, gathered where Asgard had been. They did not build new halls. They did not immediately claim dominion or establish order. They sat on the ground that had once been Odin's throne room, and they talked, though the myths don't record their words. As they sat, Vidar found something half buried in the ash and earth. He pulled it free and recognized it immediately, a golden chess piece, intricately carved, weathered, but intact. One of the pieces the old gods had used in their games, back when there had been leisure for games, back when the future seemed distant enough to ignore. He found more pieces scattered nearby, the whole set still present though dispersed, as if the players had stood and walked away mid-game and never returned. The surviving gods gathered the pieces, held them, felt their weight. These objects had outlasted the gods who used them. These small golden tokens of play and strategy and entertainment had survived fire that consumed worlds and beings, and the very tree that held reality together. There was something profound in that, something about the small and seemingly insignificant outlasting the grand and powerful. They did not resume the game, not yet. Perhaps later, when the new world had grown more familiar, when they understood what rules applied now that all the old rules had burned. For now, they simply held the pieces and remembered and wondered what it meant that they had survived when Odin had not, when Thor had not, when all the mighty and wise and powerful had fallen while the smaller, younger, less ambitious gods remained. This was not paradise. Paradise had never existed in Norse mythology, and it didn't exist now. This was something harder to name: potential, perhaps, or responsibility. The old gods had built order through murder, and maintained it through violence, and watched it all burn in the end. These new gods, or these old gods in a new world, had the opportunity to choose differently. They had witnessed the price of the old choices. They knew where pride and ambition and fear led. But knowing and doing are different things. Consciousness of past mistakes doesn't guarantee future wisdom. Every generation believes it will avoid its parents' errors, while often recreating them in slightly different forms. The surviving gods had watched Ragnarok, had seen what came of the decision to murder Ymir and build worlds from corpses. Would they choose differently? Or would the same fundamental urges toward order, toward control, toward building structures that require violence to maintain assert themselves again? The earth was green. The sky was clear. Somewhere, Lif and Lifthrasir were beginning the work of repopulating humanity. The gods held golden chess pieces and considered their next moves. And the new world waited, blank as fresh snow, ready to be written on, for better or worse, by those who had survived the ending of everything that came before. They knew how it ended, yet they fought. They knew they would lose, yet they prepared. Because in Norse mythology, the battle was never about winning. It was about meeting your doom with your eyes open, about choosing how you fall when falling is inevitable, about maintaining dignity and honor when victory is impossible. This is what makes Norse mythology unique among the world's religious and mythological traditions. Most apocalyptic narratives are about judgment. The righteous are saved, the wicked are punished. The end times separate good from evil and reward accordingly. But Ragnarok is not about moral judgment. The gods who die are not being punished for wickedness. The monsters who attack are not purely evil. This is simply how things end when order built on violence eventually calls forth answering violence, when structures raised on murder eventually collapse back into chaos. The Norse people who told these stories and believed them understood something profound about existence, that nothing lasts forever, that all things contain the seeds of their own destruction, that death comes for everyone regardless of power or virtue. If even the gods are doomed, how much more so are humans? And yet the appropriate response to certain doom is not despair or surrender. It's preparation. It's fighting well even when fighting changes nothing about the outcome. Odin knew he would be swallowed by Fenrir. He'd seen it in Mimir's well, had carried that knowledge for centuries. Yet he still gathered his army, still made his plans, still put on his armour and rode to Vigrid Plain. Not because he thought he might win, but because meeting death with dignity mattered more than avoiding death, which couldn't be avoided anyway. This is Norse heroism distilled to its essence, not victory, but valour, not success, but honour in the attempt. But perhaps Ragnarok is not truly an ending. Some interpretations suggest it's cyclical, that this destruction and rebirth has happened before and will happen again. That the universe moves through phases like seasons, each lasting ages but fundamentally temporary. Fire and ice created the first world. Fire and ice destroyed it. And from the destruction came new earth, new life, new gods who carry forward into a future that will eventually circle back to another Ragnarok, another ending, another beginning. If this interpretation is correct, then the story you've just heard is not unique but typical, one iteration in an infinite series. The gods who died will return in different forms, under different names, in a world that seems new but follows familiar patterns. Leif and Lifthrasir will eventually have descendants who build civilizations that grow complex enough to require order, and that order will eventually be imposed through violence, and that violence will eventually demand answering, and the cycle will begin again. This cyclical view was not uncommon in pre-Christian Norse culture. Time was not a line moving toward ultimate judgment, but a wheel turning through predictable phases. Seasons returned, generations repeated. Even gods, who seemed eternal, were subject to patterns larger than themselves. Perhaps this perspective made death easier to face, not as absolute ending but as transformation, as movement from one state into another within a larger pattern that continues. For the Norse people who raided and traded and farmed and fought, these myths provided framework for understanding their world. They lived in a harsh environment where winter could kill, where warfare was common, where death came early and often. Their gods reflected that reality. Odin prepared obsessively for doom. Thor fought constantly to keep chaos at bay. Loki disrupted and destabilized. And eventually, all of it led to Ragnarok, which was not punishment for sin, but simply what happens when tensions built over eons finally release. Modern readers might interpret Ragnarok through different lenses. Some see environmental metaphor, a world consumed by forces it ignored until too late, a civilization that built unsustainably and paid the price. Others see political commentary, how societies based on violence and hierarchy eventually collapse into the chaos they claim to prevent. Still, others see it as purely mythological, a story about cosmic forces personified as gods and monsters, beautiful in its tragedy, but not meant as instruction manual for life. All these interpretations carry truth. Myths are large enough to contain multiple meanings, and Ragnarok is particularly capacious in what it can hold. It's about fate and free will, about order and chaos, about the price of violence and the inevitability of endings. It's about how knowledge of doom doesn't prevent doom. It's about fighting anyway. It's about the seeds of the next world contained within the burning of this one. Perhaps what matters most is not which interpretation is correct, but that the story continues resonating after more than a millennium. That modern people, lying awake in darkness, contemplating existence, find something meaningful in these ancient narratives about gods who sacrificed and schemed and fought and died. That the question, how should we face inevitable endings, remains relevant whether those endings are personal death, or civilizational collapse, or simply the daily dissolution of certainty into sleep. We began with Ginnungagap, the void that dreamed. Fire and ice colliding in emptiness, creating the first stirrings of consciousness, building toward complexity that would eventually collapse back into simplicity. And now, after Ragnarok, perhaps we're back where we started. The void again, the gap again. The space between worlds where potential exists without form, where the next accident might happen, where fire and ice might meet again and create something new. Or perhaps we're in that moment after the earth rose green from the sea, when the surviving gods held golden chess pieces and considered their next moves. When Lif and Lifthrasir stood on fresh land and decided what kind of people they would be. When the future was blank page rather than written prophecy. When choice existed because the old certainties had burned away. The story ends here. But stories don't really end. They pause. They wait in darkness like seeds under snow. And in that waiting, in that space between telling and retelling, between sleeping and waking, Between the world that was and the world that might be, something new begins to stir, something impossible, something that will one day need its own story. Close your eyes. The void is dreaming again.